On a pale spring morning, Lorna stood in her kitchen with one hand resting on the counter and watched steam lift from a kettle that had only just begun to whisper. The window above the sink held a view she had seen for 26 years, a narrow yard, a fence with weathered boards, a lilac bush that leaned slightly to one side. Beyond it, the roofline of the house next door, where a wind chime sometimes moved even when the air looked still. For most of her adult life, Lorna had moved through mornings as though they were gates to get through. Later, when the children were grown and the house had quieted, she still hurried. She hurried through breakfast, hurried through the first light, hurried through the day before the day had made any demands. The body kept its old rhythm even after the reasons had changed. Her husband, Neil, was already at the table with the newspaper folded beside his elbow. He no longer read every page. He turned a few sheets, then let them rest. Lorna had once found his stillness irritating. She would wipe counters around him with short, efficient motions and feel that she alone understood how much there was to do. Now, at 68, she had begun to suspect that Neil had seen something earlier than she had. The kettle finished its small climb towards sound. Lorna poured water into the teapot instead of dropping a bag into a mug and carrying it around the room while doing 3 other things. She set 2 cups on the table. Neil looked up, attentive in a way that made the morning feel slightly different from the ones before it. Nothing remarkable had forced the change. There had been no crisis, only a gradual weariness. Lorna had spent years treating time like an opponent that could only be managed through speed. The faster she moved, the more righteous the movement felt. Speed looked like care. Speed looked like competence. Speed made her feel protected from disorder. But disorder had always remained. A chair out of place, a letter not yet answered, a task waiting at the edge of the afternoon. The faster she moved, the more the unfinished things multiplied in her mind, until the day felt crowded before it had fully arrived. Lorna sat down across from Neil and wrapped both hands around her cup. The tea was too hot to drink at once. She had to wait. She noticed that waiting when it was small and ordinary did not injure anything. The kitchen kept standing. Morning light moved across the table in a pale bar that reached his wrist first, then hers. Neil buttered a piece of toast with the same steady attention he gave to nearly everything now. He tied his shoes carefully, folded a dish towel into straight quarters, watered the fern on the back porch as if the fern were worth that much gentleness. Lorna used to think he had simply become old. Lately, she wondered whether he had become precise. After breakfast, she usually rose at once and began circling the house. That morning, she stayed seated. She listened to the refrigerator hum. She heard a delivery truck stop and start somewhere down the block. In the house next door, a child laughed once. Then the sound disappeared behind a closing door. These were tiny things, yet they gave the morning a shape she'd been rushing past for years. Slowing down, she was beginning to see, did not always take something away. Sometimes it returned detail. Sometimes it returned proportion. The day looked less like a pile of demands and more like a set of actual hours, each one with edges that could be felt. Lorna remembered the years when the children were small and Saturday mornings began before sunrise. Soccer games, school projects, grocery lists with one urgent item forgotten until the last minute. She had loved her family fiercely. She had also lived beside her own life as if she would step into it later, once everything else was arranged. Later never truly arrived. Instead, the children became adults. The house became quieter. and the old pace remained, running inside a life that no longer required it. A robin landed on the fence. Lorna had no memory of the yard ever lacking birds, and yet she could not remember when she had last watched one long enough to see how it moved. It hopped twice, tilted its head, then stayed still. The sight of it brought her a faint and unexpected calm. Lorna lifted the cup and took her first real sip, while the tea was still warm enough to ask for attention. Neil unfolded the paper again, then left it unread on the table. Neither of them seemed in a hurry to rescue the morning from itself. Outside, the robin flew off. The fence remained. The lilac bush leaned in the same old way. Yet everything in view looked slightly less disposable than it had the day before, as if slowness had not changed the world so much as allowed it to appear. On weekday afternoons, Raphael drove the long route to his daughter's house, even though the shorter route had fewer lights, and reached the same destination 12 minutes sooner. He told himself the long way was easier on the brakes. The truth was that it passed the river, then the old freight yard, then a row of small brick houses with porches deep enough for chairs. The extra minutes gave his mind time to arrive before his body did. Raphael, now 71, had become the regular after-school pickup for his grandson, Eli. He sat in the school line with the engine off and watched other grandparents wait in their cars. Raphael usually lowered the window an inch and let the air in. For decades, he had been a fast man in ways that did not always show from the outside. He walked quickly, ate quickly, finished other people's sentences with ideas that seemed helpful at the time. At the print shop where he worked for 38 years, speed became part of his reputation. Jobs went out on time when Raphael touched them. He liked the clean feeling of moving a day forward by force. He had not meant to miss things. He had simply believed that attention could be deferred. There would be a calmer season for conversation, a less crowded year for visiting his brother, Matteo. A weekend when he and Marissa would finally walk through the old neighborhood and let her show him which houses her school friends had lived in. The calmer season never fully arrived. Work ended. His wife died some years later after a long ordinary illness that unfolded without drama but left the house changed. The rush remained in him, moving around empty rooms. The first time Eli asked why he always drove past the river, Raphael nearly answered with the line about the brakes. Instead, he noticed the river itself, grey water moving under a low bridge. Two gulls stepping along the mud as if the shoreline belonged to them. He realized he had been using the route for months without really seeing it. So he began parking once or twice a week before pickup, just for a few minutes. Not a walk, not exercise, simply a pause at the overlook with both hands on the railing and the sound of traffic softened by distance. The river did not offer wisdom. It offered pace. Water moved around what resisted it. Clouds crossed without asking to be useful. Raphael found that if he stood there long enough, the rest of the day regained its proper size. One Tuesday, Marissa came out to the driveway while Eli carried his backpack inside. She handed Raphael a container of soup and stayed by the car door instead of rushing back into the house. Raphael noticed how often, in earlier years, he would have turned a moment like this into logistics. What time tomorrow? Whether gas was low? Which teacher sent the homework sheet? Instead, he stood still and let Marissa describe a patient who had cried in the chair from nervousness and embarrassment. Raphael did not hurry to reassure her or fix the feeling. He listened. Speed had once made him feel responsible. Slowness now made him feel available. Later in life, some people discover that hurrying had never actually protected them from grief or disorder or uncertainty. It had only hidden the texture of the hours. The slower life often reveals what was always asking to be noticed. The pause before a child runs up the sidewalk, the tiredness in an adult daughter's face, the fact that a river has been moving past the same town for longer than any schedule matters. That night, Raphael heated the soup and ate at the table instead of standing at the counter. He took out a small notepad and wrote down one thing Eli had said in the car about wanting to build a wooden bridge for a school project. He used to trust memory with things like that, and then lose them in the rush of the next day. Writing it down felt like respect. A week later, he called Matteo and asked if he wanted coffee on Saturday. The brothers had not argued. They had simply let years get arranged around intention. Matteo sounded pleased but careful, as if the invitation had to travel a distance before it could land. Raphael understood that too. Speed can shorten a workday and lengthen a silence at the same time. On Friday afternoon, he parked by the river again before school let out. The wind carried a chill from the water. A tugboat moved slowly enough to seem patient. Raphael watched until it slipped under the bridge and disappeared. Then he got back in the car and drove the last few minutes to the school, not feeling late, not feeling early, only ready enough to notice when Eli came through the doors and scanned the line until he found him. When Colleen began walking to the market instead of driving, her friends assumed it was for health. At 66, almost every visible change in a person's routine invited that explanation. Colleen let people think what they liked. The truth was simpler. Walking made the errands fit inside the day instead of swallowing it whole. For years, she had driven the same short route with strained concentration. Keys, purse, engine, parking space. Back home before the milk warmed. She moved that way through much of life. Efficiently, narrowly, with the feeling that any pause would invite disorder. Her sister Paula came by every Thursday morning to go with her to the market. After their mother died, the sisters had grown closer in a way that was not dramatic, only deliberate. Paula talked to strangers. Colleen preferred the clear relief of finishing something. Yet the weekly walk had softened those edges. The first time Colleen left the car in the driveway, she felt faintly irresponsible. The market was only 7 blocks away, but carrying bags back on foot seemed like an unnecessary complication. The eggs might crack. Speed often disguises itself as prudence. Paula arrived in a blue coat with one button missing and looked at the empty driveway with approval. They set off under a thin sky. A dog barked behind a fence. Someone had put out a clay pot with new pansies near the library steps. Halfway down Willow Street, Paula stopped to greet a neighbor, recovering from a shoulder injury, and Colleen found herself listening to details she otherwise would never have heard. Which porch plants had survived winter? None of this information was necessary. That was part of its value. The market itself looked smaller on foot. When Colleen drove, she entered it already in the mindset of departure. She stood in the produce aisle and noticed the damp scent around the lettuce crates. She compared pears without rushing. She saw an older man hold a shopping list written in large block letters and move one finger down it with great care. Slowness did not make the world empty. It made other lives visible. On the way home, the bag handles pressed into her palms, and the eggs shifted once when she stepped off a curb. Beside her, Paula described a recipe involving white beans and rosemary. Colleen would usually have answered in clipped, practical terms. That morning, she asked for the full method and listened to it from the beginning. She tried to explain to herself why the walk felt so different from driving. The distance had not changed. The groceries were the same. The hour had taken a little longer, though not much. What changed was the number of things the outing was allowed to include. The errand became a walk. The walk became conversation. Conversation became a return to the neighborhood instead of a passage through it. In younger years, Colleen believed that a well-run life was a compressed life. Tasks grouped together. Meals eaten while standing. Phone calls made while putting away laundry. She had not intended to flatten her own days. She had simply treated overlap as intelligence. By her mid-60s, she began to feel the cost. Nothing was exactly wrong, yet whole weeks passed with a thin sameness, as if every day were a page with the margins cut off. The walk to the market restored margin, a church bell in the distance, a maple root lifting one section of sidewalk, Paula laughing at a crooked scarecrow someone had left standing in a winter garden long past its season. Later in life, clarity often arrives through subtraction, one less rush, one less layer of noise. Colleen could feel that happening in small ways. She forgot fewer details when she moved slower. She became less sharp with people. She arrived home with more of herself intact. By early summer, the Thursday walk had become fixed without being formal. Paula brought cloth bags. Colleen locked the door and checked it only once instead of twice. They crossed at the same corner, paused at the same bakery window, and sometimes sat on a bench on the return trip if the weight of the bags suggested it. One morning, Paula had to cancel because her grandson was sick. Colleen considered driving just that once. Instead, she walked alone. The street seemed quieter without her sister's voice, but not vacant. She heard sparrows in a hedge. She passed the post office and noticed that one section of brick was a different color where a repair had been made years earlier. She realized she had been borrowing slowness at first. Now some of it belonged to her. When she reached home, she set the groceries on the counter and stood still before unpacking them. Butter softening in its paper. A bunch of parsley leaving droplets on the board. Daylight across the sink. The house felt like part of the same hour. That, more than the walking, was the change she had been missing. In the back of his garage, Simon kept a workbench scarred by 40 years of measuring, sanding, cutting, and starting over. The wall above it held tools arranged with a care that looked severe to anyone who did not know him. Clamps on one hook, squares on another. Small drawers labeled in narrow handwriting. Simon had built cabinets for contractors and later for clients who wanted kitchens that looked effortless. He earned his reputation through speed married to precision. If a crew needed trim by Friday, Simon found a way. If a client changed a measurement late, Simon absorbed the irritation and stayed up past midnight. Work moved because he moved. At 69, he still went into the garage each morning after breakfast. His wife, Ada, knew the pattern well enough to hear it from the kitchen, the side door opening. The radio turned low. What changed in recent years was not the fact of the work. It was the speed he kept bringing to it, as though no one had told him the deadlines were gone. One morning, Ada came out carrying 2 mugs of coffee and found Simon planing the edge of a small shelf he had already adjusted twice. The shelf was for the mudroom. It would hold gloves and hats. No client would inspect it. No invoice depended on it. Yet Simon moved with the old compressed focus, jaw set, shoulders lifted, attention narrowed to the thin ribbon of wood curling away from the blade. Simon had always loved the moment when a piece of wood finally cooperated. Grain running true, joint closing cleanly, surface meeting hand without resistance. What he loved less, though he rarely admitted it, was the waiting and the checking. In his working years, hurry had attached itself to craft so tightly that he treated them as the same thing. Now the hurry remained after the necessity had gone. He stepped back from the bench and looked at the shelf. It was already good enough. More than good enough. The extra passes of the plane were not improving it. They were discharging a restlessness he no longer needed to obey. Ada handed him a mug. They stood in the cool garage doorway where sunlight cut across the floor and lit the dust in the air. Outside, a neighbor's grandson rode a bicycle in uncertain loops at the end of the driveway. Simon watched the boy wobble. Correct. Wobble again. He noticed that no one watching him seemed impatient. Simon realized that much of his life had been spent believing that excellence required strain. If something mattered, he thought, it had to feel urgent. Calm work looked suspicious to him, yet some of his best pieces had come during the rare jobs when a client gave him time and stopped changing the plan. The best work did not always come from pressure. Often it came from enough room to notice. The next morning, he returned to the garage and began a box for his granddaughter, Elise. She liked keeping leaves and ticket stubs and smooth stones in odd places. Simon usually would have measured every part twice before cutting anything. Instead, he stood with the board in his hands for a minute and let the design settle. Hinged lid, rounded corners, one divider inside. Nothing fancy. Enough. He worked more slowly than usual. Not clumsy, not hesitant, simply unforced. He paused when the grain suggested a better direction for the saw. He sharpened a chisel before it became a problem. He sat on the stool for 5 minutes in the middle and listened to the radio. By noon, the box was only half done, and Simon felt a calm satisfaction that surprised him. Had he worked for a client, he would once have called the pace unacceptable. For Elise, for this season of life, the slower pace seemed to reveal the reason for the work, rather than delay it. Later in life, slowness can restore accuracy to more than hand. Simon had mistaken tension for devotion. He had mistaken compression for seriousness. What the box showed him was simpler. Care could be patient. Attention could breathe and still remain exact. When Ada came out again, Simon showed her the unfinished lid without apology. She ran her fingers over the sanded edge and smiled in the way she had when something needed no extra language. The garage looked the same as it always had. Tools on the wall, light across the bench, the radio speaking softly to itself. Yet the hour felt less like a contest and more like a place. A week later, Elise visited with a paper bag full of objects she intended to store in the finished box. Simon watched her arrange acorns beside old buttons and a ribbon she claimed was too pretty to throw away. She did not care that one corner of the box was slightly more rounded than the others. She cared that the lid opened smoothly and that her grandfather sat beside her long enough to see what she put inside. That was the correction slowness made. It did not reduce the work. It revealed its true center. Every Wednesday at noon, Miriam met her longtime friend Estelle at a small cafe with uneven floorboards and a front window that caught the sun for only 1 hour. In earlier years, they chose places according to efficiency. Which spot seated people quickly? Now, in their 70s, they chose the cafe because no one hurried a table along and because the soup arrived hot enough to require patience. Miriam had not always been patient with meals. She ate through much of adulthood as if food were fuel-loaded between obligations. Breakfast at the sink, sandwiches in the car. Dinner half finished because a call came in, or laundry needed switching, or someone had to be picked up. Her body received nourishment. Her mind often did not register the meal at all. When her children were young, the speed felt justified. There were rides to arrange and forms to sign. Later, when the house quieted, Miriam kept eating in the same brisk, distracted way. A person can outlive a season and still keep its posture. Estelle noticed this before Miriam did. She would stir her tea for a full minute and then look up with mild amusement while Miriam reached for the bill before dessert menus had even been considered. She did one thing at a time and seemed to trust that the next thing would still be there when she arrived. Then one winter afternoon, Miriam had lunch alone in her own kitchen and realized she could not recall what she had eaten 10 minutes later. Plate empty, mind elsewhere. The moment unsettled her. It was not about memory in the alarming sense. It was about absence. She had been present for the task of eating, absent for the experience of being alive inside the task. The weekly cafe lunch began after that, first as a pleasant idea, then as a kind of correction. Miriam and Estelle sat by the window and let the first few minutes pass without producing anything useful. They watched the owner wipe down glasses with a towel that had lost all softness. At first, Miriam still brought her old restlessness to the table. She scanned the room for service before service was needed. She mentally sorted the errands waiting afterward. Once, halfway through lentil soup, she caught herself eating ahead of the conversation, spoon already lifting before Estelle had finished describing a letter from her nephew. Miriam set the spoon down and felt embarrassed by the force of habit. By degrees, Miriam learned to stay inside the meal. She noticed the steam leaving the bowl, the way bread tasted different when torn slowly instead of bitten while thinking 3 thoughts ahead. She listened longer before responding. She asked Estelle another question instead of steering the conversation back toward whatever problem felt pending. What surprised her was not that lunch became more pleasant. It was that the rest of the day did too. When a meal is hurried, something in the mind continues hurrying afterward. Miriam could feel that clearly now. On Wednesdays after the cafe, she drove home more slowly and parked without immediately gathering everything in her lap. The house no longer met her like a list. It met her like a place she had returned to. Later in life, clarity sometimes arrives through the most ordinary gates. Soup cooling in front of 2 old friends. Bread torn slowly. A story allowed to finish. The slower life is not always built from grand changes. Often it is built from letting one small habit become human again. One rainy afternoon, Estelle brought a photograph of the 2 of them from 30 years earlier. They were standing at a school fundraiser in white aprons, each holding a tray of brownies, as if the trays themselves required management. Miriam laughed when she saw her own face. Even in a still image, she looked mid-task, eyes already leaving the frame for the next responsibility. Estelle looked directly at the camera, amused and settled. Miriam did not feel shame at the photograph, only recognition. She had been capable then, necessary then, loved then. She had also been moving too fast to inhabit the life she was holding together. After lunch one week, Estelle suggested a short detour through the park before heading home. Miriam would once have declined. Too much to do. Too damp. Too inefficient. Instead, she agreed. They walked under bare branches and stepped around small puddles reflecting the sky. Estelle talked about wanting to plant tulips in a clay pot this year. Miriam listened and noticed that the park smelled faintly of wet earth and old leaves. Nothing in that hour advanced her life in the measurable sense. No task was completed. Yet something more useful than efficiency had occurred. Her attention had stopped scattering. It had gathered. That was what slowness was giving her now. not less life, a less divided one. Arthur had a habit of filling silence before anyone asked him to. At 73, with work behind him and most of the loud years already spent, he was only beginning to see how often he had confused motion with steadiness. His wife, Helen, had long ago learned to let him talk himself empty. She simply did not fear pauses. Arthur used to interpret this as passivity. Later, he recognized it as ease. The change began in the evenings. After dinner, he and Helen started walking the same loop through the neighborhood, past the corner maple, past the pond where geese gathered in uneven clusters and seemed to spend long periods doing almost nothing. Arthur talked through the first week of those walks. He commented on lawns, told stories from his years in municipal accounting, revisited small grievances already worn smooth by repetition. Helen answered when an answer was needed and let the rest float away. One evening, near the pond, Arthur stopped speaking because a heron stood at the water's edge so still. It looked placed there by design. He and Helen both slowed. The bird did not move for several seconds, then tilted its head with a precision that seemed to contain the whole purpose of the moment. Arthur realized that if he had kept talking, he would have missed it entirely. The silence that followed did not feel empty. Arthur had been a competent and decent man. He paid bills on time, remembered anniversaries, showed up for school concerts and repairs, but competence had often come with noise. He explained too much. Filled transitions. Smoothed discomfort with information. His children, now middle-aged themselves, loved him, and they had learned to wait for the end of his first long paragraph before entering a conversation. On the walk home that evening, Arthur said little. Helen did not press him to say more. At the house, while she put the kettle on, he noticed how the kitchen sounded without his voice moving through it. Spoon against ceramic. Water beginning to tick inside the kettle. The house did not need to be kept awake. It was already awake. The next night, he tried something unfamiliar. He let Helen begin. She pointed to a stand of black-eyed Susans in a front garden and said they seemed to hold light even after sunset. Arthur looked where she was looking instead of preparing the next story. The flowers were ordinary. That was exactly why the remark mattered. The slower pace of the walk made room for small observations to land before they were replaced. After that, Arthur began noticing how often haste and speech had worked together in him. When he was younger, talking gave a sense of momentum. Momentum gave a sense of control. If a day was filled with sound, then perhaps nothing important was being neglected. In later life, he could see the weakness in that bargain. Sound can keep a person from hearing the tone of an evening, the fatigue in a spouse, the shape of a thought that needs a little room before it can fully appear. Later in life, the slower life sometimes arrives first as restraint, not saying the next thing, not hurrying to interpret. Arthur found that restraint gave more than it removed. Helen spoke more when space existed for her to do so. The walks felt longer without taking more time. The neighborhood seemed less like a backdrop and more like a place. One Sunday, their daughter, Renee, came for supper with her husband and 2 boys. Arthur listened more than usual at the table. He still talked. He was still himself. But he no longer tried to connect every story to one of his own. He watched Renee describe her younger son's habit of sorting crayons by damaged tips. And for once, Arthur did not interrupt with an explanation. He let the story stand. Renee glanced at him with mild surprise, and then with something warmer. The meal felt easier for everyone. That evening, after the dishes were done, Arthur and Helen took their walk in air that smelled faintly of grass and pavement. The pond held the last light in a flat band near the reeds. No heron appeared this time, yet the quiet itself had become companionable. Arthur understood then that slowing down did not diminish a life built on thought and language. It refined it. He still had memories and stories. Slowness did not ask him to empty them out. It asked him to stop poring them over every moment. When they reached the corner near their house, Helen slipped her hand through his arm in the familiar way she had. Arthur felt the simple pressure of it and how easy it would once have been to speak over even that. Instead, he let the sensation register fully. Warmth through the sleeve. Small shared weight. Evening around them. By the time they got home, the night had settled into place without his help. That seemed to him, for the first time, like a mercy. Marina began arriving early to the museum, though she no longer thought of it that way. The doors opened to visitors at 10, but she liked to step into the lobby at 9:30 while the building was still mostly empty. The quiet before opening had become her favorite part of the week. In younger years, Marina would have called that half-hour dead time. She had spent decades treating all unused minutes with suspicion. As a school administrator, she moved from task to task with a clipped efficiency that made other people nervous and impressed. She answered emails while eating yogurt from a paper cup, signed forms while standing. She thought this meant she was fully engaged in life. What it often meant was that she was only ever arriving at the next demand. Retirement had not removed the habit. For months, she woke with the same tightened sense of pursuit and no proper place to send it. She reorganized kitchen drawers and rewrote shopping lists already written clearly. Cal sometimes suggested a walk or an afternoon with nothing assigned to it. Marina agreed in theory, and then found something else to do. The museum changed that because it operated on a pace she could not bully. She began volunteering 2 afternoons a week at the front desk. At first, Marina tried to intensify it. She arranged brochures by exact alignment, counted pencils, revised the sign-in process in her head. Then she noticed that the most meaningful part of the shift was not the smoothness of the table. It was the minutes between tasks, when people crossed the lobby slowly and looked up. A grandfather holding a little girl's hand. 2 college students deciding whether the membership discount justified joining. A woman in a red coat who entered one rainy day and remained just inside the door for several seconds, as if she needed the quiet as much as the art. Marina found that if she arrived with extra time, she could notice all of this before the desk required her face and voice. The building itself seemed to ask for a slower register. Footsteps softened. The place was not silent, but it carried an understanding that looking takes time. One Thursday, Cal dropped her off. He came inside with her and stood for a minute under the high atrium. Then he turned in a slow circle, taking in the ceiling panels and the bench near the fountain. Marina realized she had never once stood there with him before opening and simply looked at the place where she spent these hours. They sat on the bench until her shift began. Cal pointed out the faint echo of the fountain and how the sound changed when someone crossed in front of it. Marina smiled at the remark because it was exactly the sort of detail she once would have missed while checking the clock. She had not understood until older age that museums alter pace. Later in life, many people find that slowing down changes what counts as full attention. Marina used to believe attention meant intensity, focused effort, quick response, output. Now she could feel another kind of attention emerging, receptive rather than forceful, less about managing a space and more about letting the space have an effect. The shift in her spilled quietly into other corners of life. At home, she no longer stacked the dishwasher with the same force. She stood at the sink and noticed the warmth of the water on her wrists. She let Cal finish stories without supplying conclusions. She sat on the porch in the evening and watched the street darken one house at a time. One afternoon, a boy of about 10 asked Marina at the desk where the painting with the ship was. She began to give the usual route, then stopped and walked him there because the hallway was empty and there was time. When they reached the painting, the boy stood very still. Marina watched his face change from curiosity to something quieter. She understood that he was not only seeing the picture, he was entering its pace. On her drive home, Marina thought about all the years she believed slowing down meant surrendering usefulness. The museum had shown her a gentler truth. Slowness could be a form of respect. Respect for objects, respect for people, respect for the mind's need to settle. When she got home, Cal was trimming basil at the kitchen counter. Marina set down her bag and stood beside him without immediately speaking. The leaves gave off a smell. Outside, rain had started in a fine light pattern against the window. Cal slid the bowl closer so she could help. They worked without hurry, passing stems back and forth. Nothing about the evening looked important from the outside, yet Marina felt the kind of clarity that only appears when a day is not forced past itself. She had not become less capable. She had become more willing to notice what capability was for. When Devika moved her chair from the kitchen table to the back patio, the change looked minor enough to dismiss. Same tea, same morning hour. Yet the patio required a different pace from her. Indoors she rose too easily, wiped crumbs that were barely there, checked the clock, thought of the freezer inventory. Outdoors she sat longer. At 70, Devika had become known within her family for staying on top of things. It also explained too much of her life. She stayed on top of appointments, gifts, travel plans, and school schedules when the grandchildren were younger. Even after retirement from a bookkeeping job, she maintained the same interior ledger, always balancing what had happened against what might be needed next. Her son, Aaron, admired that steadiness. Their visits often began with Devika producing something already prepared. All of it was loving. Some of it also kept her moving past the softer parts of being together. She first noticed this one Sunday when Aaron brought the children over and everyone ended up outside because the kitchen was too warm. Her granddaughter Mira knelt by a cracked terracotta pot where mint had begun spreading beyond its edge. Mira wanted to know why plants leaned toward the sun and whether the mint could live forever if no one forgot to water it. Devika gave quick, efficient answers while standing, already half-turned toward the door because she remembered she had left lentils soaking. Then she saw Lena sit down beside Mira and simply stay with the questions. Looking at the leaves, touching the damp soil, letting wonder take the long way. Devika went back inside and stood in the quiet kitchen longer than necessary. She understood in that moment that her useful habits had become a kind of barrier. Not a hostile one, a polished one. A barrier built from competent motion. The next week she moved a wicker chair outside and began taking her tea there each morning. At first the change felt unproductive. The patio held many small things asking to be handled. Pollen on the table, a clay saucer with a chip in it. She watched herself notice each flaw, and then watched the impulse to rise. Slowly, she learned that seeing something did not always require fixing it at once. From the chair, she could hear life behind the fence. Someone practicing piano scales in a nearby house. Before, these sounds had blended into background. Sitting still gave them contour. She also began tending the plants differently. Her old method had been brisk and managerial. Water everything. Trim what needed trimming. Sweep fallen leaves before they stuck. The new method was slower. She noticed which basil stems were thriving. She moved one pot and discovered that afternoon light suited it better. She pinched mint leaves and rubbed them between her fingers before deciding whether to cut more. Later in life, clarity can arrive through contact with small living things that refuse hurry. Plants do not improve because a person checks them constantly. They respond to light, to patience, and enough space. Devika began to suspect the same was true of parts of human life she had managed too tightly. One Friday, Mira came over after school while Aaron took a work call in the car. Devika led her to the patio and, instead of presenting a finished snack immediately, asked whether she wanted to help repot the mint. Mira said yes with the full seriousness children bring to dirt. Together they tipped the plant out onto newspaper and found the roots wound thick around the soil. Devika let the process take time. Mira asked whether roots got lonely in small pots, whether mint liked hearing people talk. Devika answered some questions and let others remain open. Not every curiosity needed to be converted into information. After they finished, they sat with lemonade under the striped umbrella and looked at the newly widened pot. Mira declared it looked relieved. Devika almost laughed at the accuracy of the word. Relieved was how she herself had been feeling. The patio did not transform her into a different woman. She still made lists, still remembered appointments before anyone else, still preferred cupboards that closed properly. The difference was that slowness had entered the pattern. Tea before tasks, looking before adjusting, staying seated long enough for a child's question to become more than a prompt for an answer. By late summer, the patio plants looked fuller than they had in years. Visitors might have credited Devika's care, and they would not have been wrong. But the care was no longer only efficient. It had become attentive. That was the gift the slower life had started giving her. Not less order. Order with room in it. Room for weather. Room for conversation. Room for the fact that some things, once given a little more time, reveal what they needed all along. On Monday afternoons, Beverly stopped answering the phone for 1 hour. The choice would have sounded absurd to her younger self. What if someone needed something? What if the pharmacy had a question? Beverly had spent most of adult life available on instinct, as though responsiveness were the proof of love and competence joined together. At 72, she kept the cordless handset in 3 rooms. Beverly preferred to be reachable. Reachable had become her posture years ago, when her parents were aging and 2 children still needed rides, signatures, and reminders. In those years, the phone had truly mattered. The years changed. Her parents died. The children grew steady. Her husband, Frank, retired. Yet Beverly's body still answered every ring with the same brief lift of alertness. It was Frank who first noticed the cost. They would sit down with sandwiches on the porch, and Beverly would jump up before the second ring was finished. They would start a card game after dinner, and she would lose the thread of it because someone from church wanted to confirm a date already confirmed twice. Nothing dramatic happened. 100 small interruptions had become the climate of her days. One cloudy afternoon, Janine arrived with a box of old family photographs. She spread them across the dining room table and asked Beverly to help sort them by decade. Beverly agreed at once, pleased by the task. There were school portraits with stiff collars, a faded picture of Frank leaning against a truck he no longer owned. Beverly found a photo of herself in her 30s, standing beside her mother at a church picnic, both of them looking slightly sunburned and very busy. In the picture, Beverly was turned halfway towards something outside the frame, one hand still holding a serving spoon. Then the phone rang. Beverly stood up automatically. Janine looked at her, then at the photograph still in Beverly's hand. The look was simply clear. Beverly sat back down, The machine picked up. A recorded voice began offering a discount on roof cleaning. Something about the triviality of the call made the whole pattern visible at once. Beverly felt how often she had stepped out of her own life for things that did not matter. Even when the call was real, it rarely required that exact second. She had allowed the possibility of urgency to outrank the reality in front of her. The ring had become a command. So the following Monday, she did something small and, to her, almost radical. She unplugged the kitchen phone at 2 o'clock, left the other two in their cradles, and sat down on the porch with Frank and a bowl of sliced apples. The silence between them felt ceremonial. At first, Beverly could hardly settle. She imagined missed messages accumulating in secret. She pictured errands multiplying because she had failed to respond fast enough. The mind, once trained to constant readiness, does not trust slowness immediately. Then the hour widened. A breeze moved through the maple at the edge of the yard. Frank peeled the label from his ginger ale bottle in one long, careful strip. Beverly noticed the red of the neighbor's geraniums and realized she had lived beside them for 2 summers without really seeing their color. Later in life, clarity sometimes arrives when a person stops mistaking interruption for importance. The ring of a phone. The slower life can begin with a border this small. 1 hour returned to itself. By the 3rd Monday, Beverly began to look forward to the hour. Janine started dropping by with other boxes to sort because she could tell her mother was different during that time, less angled toward elsewhere. Together they labeled envelopes, laughed at old haircuts, and left some pictures unsorted because each one led to a memory worth finishing. Frank seemed to relax too. He told longer stories while shelling pistachios. Beverly listened without glancing toward the kitchen. She had not realized how many of their conversations had been punctured in the middle and then poorly stitched back together. The world did not collapse from her brief absence. The pharmacy still called back later if it needed something real. Most of the missed calls were sales pitches, wrong numbers, or matters that turned out to be softer than their ringtone implied. Beverly understood then that speed had not only been stealing time, it had been fragmenting attention into pieces too small to hold much joy. 1 hour a week began teaching her what the rest of the week had been missing. In autumn, she moved the practice to the sunroom when the porch grew cold. Same hour, same unplugged phone. Frank brought tea. Janine sometimes came. Sometimes Beverly sat alone and looked through a stack of photographs without arranging them into categories at all. For once, the point was not to finish. The point was to remain with what had already arrived. Lucille had lived in the same apartment building for years and knew almost nothing about the lobby, except that it stood between parking and home. The space had 2 artificial ficus trees and a bench. For years, Lucille crossed it at practical speed, keys ready. Elevator button pressed before the purse was fully on her shoulder. She was always in the building, rarely in the moment of entering it. At 68, retirement had not made her less busy. Her work as a dental receptionist ended, but the pace remained. She filled mornings with calls, errands, and calendar notes. Mallory said Lucille still handled her own life as if she were covering for absent co-workers. What made Lucille notice it was a small stiffness in one ankle that appeared each morning when she came downstairs. The doctor suggested supportive shoes and less rushing on stairs. Less rushing sounded like surrender, yet the ankle kept delivering the same plain message every morning. Slow down enough to feel the ground. So she did, though reluctantly at first. She used the handrail, stood still at the landing instead of taking the next step while planning the afternoon. Walked through the lobby at something closer to an actual human pace. She noticed the smell first. Lemon polish, radiator heat, and the faint paper smell of the mailboxes. Then she notices that people were often there. A man from the third floor, whom she had thought of only as the one with the green hat, sat on the bench each morning reading the sports page. A young mother in apartment 2B spent several minutes after daycare drop-off reorganizing a stroller basket. An older woman named Pilar watered the ficus trees with a plastic pitcher because she said someone ought to. Lucille had passed all of them for years with the polite blur of someone in transit. Once she slowed, the building stopped feeling like a container and started feeling like a place where lives touched lightly. The man with the green hat turned out to be called Walter. The young mother's name was Tessa. None of these details solved anything, yet they altered the texture of Lucille's days. Later in life, the slower life often reveals community where hurry had seen only background. A bench becomes a meeting place. A building full of strangers becomes companionable. Lucille's daughter began visiting on Thursday evenings with takeout and a bag of laundry because Mallory's machine had broken again. Lucille used to treat those visits as opportunities to optimize. Fold this first. Eat while the second load spins. After a few weeks of slower mornings in the lobby, she noticed the same impulse rising during Mallory's visits and, for the first time, did not automatically obey it. One Thursday, she left the clean towels in the basket and sat down with Mallory before opening the food containers. Mallory leaned back in her chair and relaxed. The conversation wandered. Work frustrations, a neighbor's cat that kept visiting the wrong balcony, a memory of the summer Mallory tried to sell painted rocks at the end of the driveway. Lucille laughed at herself when the memory surfaced. Even then, she had tried to improve a simple thing until it nearly lost its shape. The ankle stiffness remained, but she no longer thought of it only as inconvenience. It had introduced friction into a life that had become too automatic. Because she moved more slowly through the building now, she began lingering in other places too. At the mailbox, at the stove while soup warmed, at the window above the sink when evening light flared gold and then went dull again. One Saturday, she found Pilar in the lobby holding a paper sack full of bulbs and looking uncertain about whether the small bed by the entrance could support flowers this late in the season. Lucille would once have given a brisk opinion and continued to the car. Instead, she set down her grocery bag and helped kneel the sack open on the bench. Together, they read the planting instructions. Walter came down and contributed a pocket knife for cutting twine. Tessa passed through with the stroller and promised to bring a trowel from her car. By noon, 4 people who had mostly been hallways to one another were standing in cold dirt by the front steps, planting bulbs. Lucille felt, in that ordinary shared effort, a kind of clarity she could not have scheduled. Slowing down had not trapped her in smallness. It had made smallness meaningful. The building was still only a building, yet it had become part of her life instead of a passage around it. When evening came, she rode the elevator up with her groceries and the smell of soil still on her hands. The doors closed with their usual tired slide. Nothing grand had happened. Still, she knew something had shifted. The slower life was not asking her to accept less from the world. It was showing her how much she had been stepping over on the way to elsewhere. At the edge of a public library parking lot, Denise sat in her car with the engine off and a hardcover book on the passenger seat that had already been renewed twice. She had not finished it. In younger years, that fact would have annoyed her. She had once treated reading like a small ladder. A stack of titles moved through efficiently, each one completed, discussed, and placed on a shelf in a tidy line. Now, at 67, she found herself lingering over pages and sometimes setting the book down for 20 minutes just to think while afternoon light moved across the rug. Denise had been an elementary school principal for nearly 3 decades. Her days ran on bells, form, signatures, and the low, constant tension of being needed from many directions at once. She became excellent at deciding quickly which parent call came first, which teacher needed support, which problem would grow if left untouched for another hour. Quickness had once felt like maturity. After retirement, she kept the same inner tempo. She chose the fastest grocery line, folded laundry standing up, cooked with one eye on the clock for no clear reason. Even reading became another task to complete, one more proof that time was being used well. The library altered that without asking permission. She began going on Thursdays because the place was quiet then. A few older men read newspapers near the windows. A mother with a stroller moved slowly through the picture books. Denise would return a novel, select another, and usually carry both to a chair before checking out, as if she needed a minute to be sure the next book belonged to the life she was currently living. One Thursday, she chose a history of gardens and sat by the tall front windows. She expected to skim the first chapter and move on. Instead, she stopped after 2 pages because one sentence about patience in planting stayed with her. She looked up and saw a young employee reshelving books one by one with an attentiveness that made the whole room feel steadier. Denise realized that reading slowly was not the same as losing focus. Sometimes slowness was the form attention took when it was no longer trying to impress anyone. That recognition followed her home. At the kitchen table, she left the book open beside a bowl of peaches and read one section twice. She remembered how in her working years, she used books partly as a defense against inner noise. Finishing them quickly gave a clean feeling, a sense that the day had yielded something measurable. Yet the books she truly remembered were rarely the ones she moved through fastest. They were the ones she allowed to settle. Her sister, Carla, came by that evening with a loaf of bread, still warm from a bakery across town. Denise usually would have marked her page, set the book aside with slight irritation, and turned to conversation as a duty. That evening, she stayed with the paragraph long enough to finish it, then closed the book completely before going to the door. The small decision made the visit feel less interrupted and more received. Carla sat at the table and talked about her plans to repaint a narrow hallway she had been avoiding for months. Denise listened without glancing back at the book. She did not feel torn between two worthwhile things. The slower afternoon had already changed the pace inside her. The conversation could have its full shape because the reading had been given one. Later in life, a person sometimes finds that haste had been flattening even the pleasures it meant to preserve. Reading, eating, conversation, light through a window. All of them become thinner when approached with the posture of completion. Denise could feel another posture beginning to take hold. Not laziness, not drift. A willingness to remain where she was long enough for detail to arrive. The next week at the library, she returned the garden book only half finished and checked it out again instead of apologizing to herself for not being done. The clerk stamped the due date with no sign that anything unusual had happened. Denise felt almost amused by the relief of this. A book could stay in progress. An idea could take a few more afternoons. Nothing in the building insisted that she move faster than understanding. By early autumn, she had developed a quiet habit. She read fewer books and remembered more of them. She copied a line now and then onto a notepad by her chair. Sometimes she closed the book and watched dust turn in the sunlight for a minute before resuming. The reading no longer served as proof of discipline. It served as company. That was the clarity slowness had brought her. It had not taken sharpness away. It had given depth back to things she already loved. On Saturday mornings, Gregory used to mow his lawn with the clipped determination of a man trying to keep disorder from gaining ground. The yard was modest, a rectangle of grass, 2 shrubs, 1 narrow bed along the porch. Yet he moved across it as though reputation depended on each pass of the mower. Gregory had worked most of his life as a postal carrier. The job had trained him to keep moving through weather, delay, and interruption without indulging any of them. He liked that version of himself. Reliable, brisk, hard to derail. At 69, retired for several years, he still woke early on weekends with the feeling that visible progress must be made before noon. His wife, Evelyn, preferred mornings that opened slowly. She watered the porch pots with a small copper can and paused to inspect each leaf, as if every plant had its own particular temperament. Gregory found this endearing and faintly irrational. Plants grew, or they did not. The point was maintenance. Then, one July morning, the mower refused to start. Gregory pulled the cord until his shoulder tightened. He checked the fuel, muttered under his breath, and tried again. Evelyn watched from the porch without offering advice. After a while, he gave up and sat on the steps, irritated less by the broken machine than by the sudden blank space it created in the morning. Without the mower, the yard looked different, not worse, simply less divided into tasks. Bees moved around the lavender by the walk. A patch of clover near the side fence held small white blooms Gregory had never noticed because he usually cut them down before they had time to declare themselves. Evelyn came down and set a glass of water beside him. They sat without speaking much. Gregory could hear a radio somewhere 2 houses over. A basketball thumped at the end of the block. The lawn, still uncut, moved slightly in the heat and breeze together. He realized the yard had been asking for observation all along, and he had been giving it management instead. The mower stayed broken for another week because the repair shop was backlogged. During that week, Gregory watered by hand in the evenings and found himself walking the perimeter slowly. He noticed which corner stayed damp longer after rain. He noticed a line of ants using the same crack in the path each day. He noticed that the side of the porch caught golden light for only 20 minutes before dusk, and that Evelyn had probably known this for years. In younger years, Gregory treated chores as the spine of a decent life. There was truth in that. Things do need tending. But somewhere along the way, he had begun using tasks to outrun the quieter parts of living. If the lawn was cut, the gutters clear, the garage swept, then perhaps the day could count as solid whether or not he had truly inhabited it. Later in life, the smaller routines can reveal this with surprising force. It is not always the grand events that show a person the limits of speed. Sometimes it is a mower that will not start, and a week in which the grass is allowed to become itself. One evening, their granddaughter, June, stopped by on her bicycle and leaned it against the fence. She pointed out a butterfly near the lavender and then another one close to the clover patch. Gregory almost told her he would mow the next day and clean the whole area up. Instead, he crouched beside her and followed the thin, drifting motion of both insects through the yard. June described one as floating like tissue paper. Gregory had no better phrase for it. When the mower finally came back repaired, he started it once, then shut it off after only a few rows. The whole lawn did not need reducing at the same speed. He left the far strip near the fence a little longer. Evelyn looked at it from the porch and smiled in recognition of something she did not need explained. Through the rest of summer, Gregory kept the yard differently, not neglected, not wild, just less conquered. The work still got done, but the hour around the work widened enough to include birds, weather, and the fact that a person might stand still there in the middle of a task without the task collapsing. The slower life had not made him careless. It had made him accurate in a new way. Grass was not only something to cut. A morning was not only something to use. Under the old pace, he had preserved order. Under the newer one, he began to notice life itself, moving quietly through the same patch of ground he thought he already knew. In the laundry room of her apartment building, Eileen stood beside two humming machines and watched the first spin cycle turn a white pillowcase into a soft, revolving blur. She had always liked getting laundry done. Clean stacks felt reliable. The work had a beginning, a middle, and a satisfying end. What had changed at 74 was the way she moved through the waiting. For most of adult life, Eileen never let a washer run without attaching 2 or 3 other tasks to it. Pay bills while the load turns, wipe counters before the rinse cycle, return calls during the dryer. She had raised 3 sons, worked part-time at a florist, and cared for a mother who preferred not to ask for help but needed it anyway. Waiting became an opportunity to catch up. The mind learned to treat every pause as waste, unless something else could be tucked inside it. Now the sons lived elsewhere. Her mother was long gone. And Eileen still came into the laundry room armed with a list she rarely needed. One Wednesday, she forgot the list on the kitchen counter and felt almost exposed without it. The room was plain, beige tile, a folding table with one wobbling leg, a bulletin board crowded with faded notices for piano lessons, pet sitting, and a coat drive from 2 winters earlier. Eileen put her detergent away and sat on the plastic chair by the window because there was nothing else to do. At first, she felt the old restlessness rise at once. She could have gone upstairs and back, could have sorted the drawer of spare batteries, could have found something small to improve. Instead, she stayed. From the window, she could see a narrow alley, a patch of ivy, and the back steps of the building next door. A young man carried groceries up one arm at a time. A woman in a yellow sweater shook a rug over the railing and then stood looking out for several seconds without any visible errand attached to her stance. Eileen found the sight unexpectedly comforting. Later that afternoon, her friend Marjorie came down with a basket of towels balanced on one hip. Marjorie was the sort of person who did not regard shared silence as a problem. She loaded her machine, sat at the other end of the folding table, and began pairing socks with slow, exact motions. Eileen realized that in earlier years she might have talked too much, simply to justify the time. Now she was content to let the room carry part of the companionship for them. After a while, Marjorie mentioned that the building manager planned to repaint the hallway in spring. Eileen listened to the ordinary remark as though it belonged to the whole life of the place. The machines turned. A dryer clicked. Light shifted along the edge of the bulletin board. None of it was dramatic. Yet the hour felt inhabited rather than merely spent. In youth and middle age, people often imagine that efficiency protects them from being overwhelmed. Sometimes it does. But it can also train the mind to fear unstructured minutes. Eileen was beginning to see that fear clearly. The waiting between tasks had looked empty only because she had been moving too quickly to enter it. On the following Wednesday, she brought a small tin of peppermint lozenges and no list. She read 2 pages of a magazine and then stopped because the words could not compete with the simple scene of steam rising faintly when someone opened a dryer. She folded shirts with more care than urgency. She watched a little boy help his grandmother match washcloths by color and saw how pleased he looked to be included in something slow. Later in life, clarity sometimes arrives in the spaces that once seemed too small to matter. The 6 minutes before a rinse cycle, the quiet folding of warm towels, a shared room where no one is performing importance. These are minor passages in a day, but minor passages can hold a life together more gently than constant motion ever did. By winter, Eileen had come to prefer the middle of the laundry process to the end of it. The waiting, once avoided, had become the part that steadied her. She still liked the neat stacks carried upstairs. She still liked opening a drawer and finding order. But she no longer needed the machines to be background to some more impressive use of time. The turning itself was enough. It gave the hour a rhythm she could lean against. When she returned to her apartment with the basket warm against her coat, the rooms felt less like tasks waiting to be resumed and more like a continuation of the same calm. That, she understood, was what the slower life had been restoring in her. Not idleness, sequence. One thing done with enough attention that the next thing did not have to be rushed into meaning. Across from the train station, Leonard kept a small watch repair counter inside a shop that also sold pens, batteries, and envelopes. The station itself had been renovated twice over the years. Screens were brighter now, seats firmer, announcements cleaner. But Leonard's corner remained much as it had been. A glass case, a narrow stool, tiny screwdrivers laid in a row like surgical tools for time itself. He was 76 and no longer needed to work full days. His daughter, Elaine, had suggested several times that he close the counter and enjoy retirement more fully. Leonard always nodded. Then he opened the shop again on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, because the truth was that he liked being present when people brought him things they had stopped understanding. A watch that ran fast. One that stopped overnight. A clasp that stuck. For many years, Leonard treated the work with the compressed discipline of a man trained by deadlines. Trains arrived. People waited. If a battery could be replaced in 5 minutes instead of 8, he took quiet pride in that margin. Quick hands meant competence. Competence meant dignity. It was a good ethic, and it served him well. What changed was not the work itself, but the station beyond the glass. He began noticing how everyone around him moved as if late, shoes striking tile with the same clipped intent, bags dragging, eyes pinned to departure boards. Young commuters gulped coffee while walking. Older travelers stood at the edge of impatience as if any delay were a personal insult. Leonard understood the feeling. He had lived by it. Then one rainy morning, a woman came in with a watch that belonged to her father. The strap was worn nearly white at the bend, and the second's hand trembled rather than advanced. She did not need it immediately. She only wanted to know whether it could be repaired. Leonard opened the back slowly and found himself explaining, more to himself than to her, how some older mechanisms required a quieter hand than speed allowed. After she left, he kept thinking about that phrase, a quieter hand. That afternoon, his grandson, Owen, visited after a college class nearby. Owen sat on the stool usually reserved for customers and watched Leonard reset a crown stem under the magnifying lens. Leonard noticed how much calmer he worked when someone was merely watching instead of waiting. The parts became clearer, the movements steadier. He had always believed speed was proof of mastery. Now he suspected that mastery, in its later and truer form, looked almost slow. From then on, he began opening the shop 10 minutes earlier and doing nothing for those first minutes except winding the clocks he kept on the back shelf. A round brass one with a scratched face, a square black one from an office closing years ago, a travel clock with leather peeling at one corner. The sound of winding them one by one changed the morning. The station still buzzed outside. Inside, the little motions restored scale. Later in life, slowness sometimes brings clarity because it reveals what a person had been serving without realizing it. Leonard thought he had been serving efficiency. In truth, he had always been serving attention. Attention to springs, gears, worn straps, human patience, and the odd tenderness people feel toward objects that have measured part of their lives. Elaine came by one Thursday with soup in a jar and stood at the counter while Leonard reassembled a watch face under the lens. She used to urge him to stop working because she feared the labor itself was too much. Watching him now, she seemed to understand that the slower pace had changed the meaning of the place. It was no longer a site of proving. It had become a room where time could be handled carefully. When a train announcement echoed through the station, Leonard did not flinch or hurry. He finished the tiny screw he was turning, and only then looked up. The shop had begun teaching him something that the wider world rarely did. Time need not always be chased in order to be honored. By closing hour, the rain had thinned. Commuters still crossed the concourse in their quick, familiar streams. Leonard locked the case, turned off the lamp, and stood for a moment with the watches behind him ticking in slightly different rhythms. None of them kept time in exactly the same way, yet together they filled the room with steadiness. He thought there was a lesson in that, though he did not need to name it. The slower life had not taken his usefulness away. It had let him hear what usefulness sounded like when haste was no longer drowning it out. At the community pool, Judith arrived 15 minutes before the lane signs were set out, though the class she attended began at 10 and never started on the minute anyway. She liked those early minutes better than the exercise itself. The water lay flat and pale under the overhead lights. A maintenance worker moved a long pole across the surface in patient strokes. The room sounded like ventilation, echo, and the small hollow drip budam from the diving board. No one used during weekday mornings. Judith was 71 and had spent most of life moving as though the day were a narrow hallway crowded with obligations. She taught music in middle schools for years and carried that job home in invisible ways, planning lessons, marking attendance forms, remembering which child needed firm structure and which one needed a softer landing. Even leisure became scheduled with the same practical severity. Her husband, Peter, had been retired longer than she had and seemed to enter each day by listening to it first. Judith admired this and mistrusted it. She feared that without a brisk internal tempo, the hours would dissolve. At the pool, she discovered the opposite. The class itself was ordinary. Water weights, gentle leg lifts, slow walking against resistance. No one in the room was trying to become exceptional. That relieved her more than she expected. Yet what stayed with her most was the period before anyone got in. The moment the body had nowhere to go but into readiness. One morning, a woman named Sandra, who always wore a navy swim cap, sat beside Judith on the bench and rubbed lotion into her hands. Neither seemed inclined toward much conversation. They watched the pool staff unroll lane dividers that made soft clicking sounds as they crossed the water. Judith realized how little of her old life had contained this kind of shared quiet. Even rehearsals and concerts carried performance. Here, the room simply gathered people. After class, Judith used to dry off quickly, dress quickly, and head out before the parking lot filled. Lately, she had begun sitting in the lobby with Peter, who picked her up because he liked the nearby bakery and the two routines fit together. He brought tea in paper cups with lids that never sat quite straight. Judith sat with damp hair under a knit hat and looked out at the small stand of winter trees near the road while Peter ate a raisin roll in deliberate bites. The lobby was not beautiful. Plastic chairs, a bulletin board, smudged windows. Yet the hour after the pool felt less rushed than whole afternoons once had. Judith no longer treated the class as a task completed. She let it become part of a slower current that included the drive home, hanging up the towel and standing at the sink a minute longer than necessary while the kettle reheated. Later in life, some people learn that slowing down is not merely the absence of strain, It is the recovery of sequence, one act leading cleanly into another, instead of being stacked, rushed, and partially lived. Judith could feel that happening now. The calm before the class made the movement in the water easier. The tea afterward made the rest of the morning feel less split apart. One Tuesday, their daughter, Melissa, called while Judith and Peter sat in the lobby. In earlier years, Judith would have answered at once, combining the conversation with gathering her coat and checking whether she had forgotten anything in the locker room. That day, she let the phone ring through and called back from the car once she was buckled in and settled. Melissa sounded no less glad to hear from her. The call had not required haste, only presence. This small correction spread quietly through Judith's life. She began leaving a book open on the side table, instead of insisting on finishing chapters in one sitting. She listened to piano recordings in the evening, without also sorting mail. She gave the soup on the stove time to simmer, instead of turning up the heat to make dinner arrive faster. By spring, the early pool arrival had become non-negotiable. Judith valued the flat water, the slow setting of the lane ropes, the fact that a room full of older bodies could prepare for movement without embarrassment or spectacle. Nothing there was glamorous. That was part of the clarity. The slower life was not asking her to become less alive. It was making plain how much life had been hidden inside transitions she once treated as disposable. When Peter pulled into the driveway after one of those mornings, Judith did not leap out of the car while the engine was still running. She gathered her bag, felt the warm cup in her hand, and stepped onto the pavement with the sense that the day had already begun in the right key. Near the back of a narrow bakery, Harold shaped dough on a floured table while the first trays cooled on metal racks and the front windows slowly brightened from black to grey. He was 68, broad-shouldered, careful with his wrists, and quieter than most customers expected from a man who sold bread for a living. In his younger years, Harold loved the pre-dawn speed of the place. Mix, knead, proof, bake, repeat. Timers mattered. Oven space mattered. A late tray could pull the whole morning off balance. He wore his efficiency like part of the apron. Customers praised the bread, but Harold privately took more pride in how much he could do before sunrise. His niece, April, had joined him 3 mornings a week after deciding office work left her too drained in the wrong way. She learned quickly but not hurriedly. Harold noticed that she watched the dough longer than he did. She waited for texture. She noticed how one batch was slightly colder than another and adjusted without making the observation dramatic. At first, he saw this as inexperience. Then he saw that her loaves were often better. One Thursday, while rain tapped lightly against the back door, Harold was shaping rolls too quickly and left faint seams on several of them. April said nothing. She simply set her own tray beside his. Her dough held smoother tension. Harold felt the old impulse to move even faster and prove that volume mattered more than perfection. Instead, he stopped. He looked at his hands. Flour in the lines of his knuckles. A little stiffness near the thumb. He had been treating the morning as something to conquer, when in fact the bread had always asked for a more measured partnership. Heat, rest, timing, touch. None of these yielded to impatience without cost. After that day, he changed one small habit. He began leaving 5 extra minutes between mixing and shaping the first dough, not because the recipe required it on paper, but because the room did. He noticed humidity. He noticed how the dough responded differently on cold mornings. He noticed that when he moved slower, he wasted less flour and made fewer unconscious corrections. His wife, Teresa, who handled the register 3 days a week, saw the shift before he named it. Harold no longer came home with the same compressed fatigue around his eyes. He still worked hard, the bakery still filled with warm bread by opening, but the work had grown less adversarial, more exact, less like a test of stamina. Later in life, slowness can clarify the nature of skill. What once looked like speed is often only the rough outer shell of experience. Beneath it is timing, and beneath timing is trust. Harold had spent years trusting himself to push. Now he was learning to trust the materials, the weather, the hour, and the quiet sequence that made the bread good long before it made him feel accomplished. One Saturday, a little line formed at the counter, and Harold watched April take orders while Teresa wrapped loaves in paper. Customers chatted about soup plans and grandchildren visiting for the weekend. No one in front cared whether the bread had been shaped in a hurry. They cared that it smelled right, tore well, and seemed made by hands that respected the work. That recognition followed Harold after closing. He and Teresa sat at their kitchen table with heel pieces spread with butter. Harold used to eat standing up after a shift, too tired to separate hunger from momentum. Now he sat long enough to taste the crust properly and notice how quiet the house sounded after the ovens had been shut down. Through the season, he kept refining his pace. He turned the radio lower, let dough rest fully, accepted that some mornings could not be forced into perfect sameness, and did not need to be. April, seeing this, relaxed too. Their movements at the table grew almost companionable, each one leaving room for the other. By late autumn, Harold understood what the slower life had given him. Not less output, better relationship with process. Bread had always required patience. He had simply been skilled enough for years to ignore that truth and still get by. Now the truth itself had become part of the pleasure. Before locking up each day, he walked once along the cooling racks with no task in hand. He looked at the loaves as if they had arrived by time as much as by labor. Then he turned off the backlight and stood in the thin smell of flour and yeast for a moment longer than necessary. The pause did not delay the day. It completed it. At the far end of the botanical conservatory, where humid air clouded the glass and the benches were always slightly damp, Sonia sat with a sketchbook open on her knees and a pencil she sharpened too often out of habit. She was 73 and had only started drawing in earnest after retirement, though she had loved looking at things closely for most of her life. Her husband, Malcolm, came with her every other week and wandered on his own among the palms while Sonia chose one plant and stayed with it. He preferred movement. She preferred staying. What they shared was an emerging faith that an hour need not be filled with productivity to be complete. For years, Sonia had worked in a tax office where precision was measured by deadlines and mistakes announced themselves quickly. The job trained her to read fast, catch discrepancies, and move from one folder to the next without sentiment. At home, she carried the same practice compression into cooking, cleaning, and even leisure. Museums were walked briskly. Trips were planned down to the hour. Beauty was noticed, but often in passing. Drawing disrupted that logic because it refused haste from the first line. The conservatory volunteer at the entrance once told her that orchids changed appearance the longer a person looked. Sonia dismissed the phrase as a pleasant exaggeration until she sat with one purple blossom for nearly 40 minutes and discovered that its shape kept deepening. Fold within fold, a darker vein hidden in the petal, a slight asymmetry that made the flower feel less decorative and more alive. She took the sketch home unfinished and returned the next week to continue it. This annoyed the part of her that still wanted tidy completion. The conservatory seemed untroubled by incompletion. Leaves unfurled when they were ready. New buds appeared without asking whether the previous ones had been fully appreciated. Malcolm would circle back after his walk and find her in nearly the same position, adding small lines around a stem as if time had softened instead of passed. One afternoon, a child near the koi pond dropped a brochure and cried from the shock more than the loss. Sonia looked up from her page and saw how quickly the mother crouched, gathered the child, and slowed her own breathing first. The scene lasted less than a minute, yet Sonia noticed it with the same concentration she gave the leaves. Slowness, she was learning, did not stay inside art. It altered what the eye considered worthy of attention. Later in life, the slower life often reveals that perception itself has been rushed. People think they are seeing because their eyes pass over things. Real seeing is different. It takes repetition, quiet, and the willingness to remain before a subject after the first impression has already been taken. At home, Sonia began transferring the conservatory sketches onto heavier paper. Malcolm sometimes sat across from her with the newspaper open but unread, content to let the room carry its own calm. He had once worried that retirement would leave them bored or overly aware of each other's habits. Instead, their slower routines had made each one gentler at the edges. Silence no longer implied distance. It implied company. When their daughter, Nina, visited with soup and clementines, Sonia showed her one of the finished drawings without apology for its imperfections. Nina studied the page longer than Sonia expected and then looked at the actual leaf on the windowsill that had served as a second reference. Sonia could tell that the drawing had preserved not just shape but duration. The plant had been looked at long enough to gather into the page. Through winter, she kept going back to the conservatory. Not every sketch was good. Some remained unfinished in a stack by the chair, yet the practice steadied her far beyond the drawings themselves. She washed dishes more slowly, folded scarves with an almost amused care, paused at the mailbox to notice frost patterns on the metal panel. The slower life had not made the world smaller. It had made ordinary scale more visible. A leaf vein, a clouded window, the soft sound of Malcolm clearing his throat from the bench across the room. These things had always been present. What changed was her willingness to stay near them. One late afternoon, as the conservatory lights came on against the early dark, Sonia closed the sketchbook and did not feel pressure to have finished anything final. She had spent an hour in close company with a fern, a bench, warm air, and her own settling attention. The clarity in that hour was simple and complete enough. Nothing had been lost by going slowly. Something had been returned. When the charity thrift store changed managers and reorganized the donation room, Calvin found himself assigned to the task of sorting buttons, ribbons, and sewing notions that had accumulated in biscuit tins, shoeboxes, and old cookie jars over the years. He was 78 and volunteered there because his wife, Louise, thought one weekly place of visible usefulness was good for him. Calvin had spent a long career in freight logistics, a field that rewarded rapid decisions and punished hesitation. Containers arrived, schedules shifted, problems multiplied unless met with immediate action. Even after retirement, he tended to move through volunteer work with the same urgent style. Shelves had to be straightened at once, donations processed before they could form a pile. He took private satisfaction in making disorder disappear. The sewing room defeated that instinct. Buttons could not be hurried. They were too small, too mixed, too attached to histories no one now remembered. Pearl buttons in a jar with cracked plastic toggles, wooden ones wrapped in thread, cards of snaps still pinned shut from shops that no longer existed. Calvin sat at a table beneath a lamp and felt, for the first 10 minutes, almost insulted by the scale of the work. Then Louise came by with 2 cups of coffee and sat across from him to help. She had sewn for years and recognized uses where he saw only categories. She turned a handful of green buttons in her palm and noticed their slight differences of shade. Calvin would have labeled them all the same and moved on. Louise separated them carefully into 3 piles: moss, bright leaf, deep olive. The distinctions seemed unnecessary until he looked closer. The room itself encouraged a slower mind. Sun fell through lace curtains left from a donation no one sold. A mannequin without arms leaned near the wall. Somewhere in the front room, hangers clicked along a metal rod in uneven bursts. Calvin found that once he stopped trying to finish the sorting quickly, the objects themselves became interesting. A mother-of-pearl button with one edge chipped. A tiny card of black hooks still priced at 39 cents. Spools of thread faded on one side where years of sunlight had reached them through a box lid. Later in life, slowness can bring clarity by lowering the threshold of what counts as worth noticing. In his working years, Calvin needed broad categories: move, delay, shortage, overflow. That habit served him well. Here, in the thrift store sewing room, such broadness would have missed the point entirely. The work asked for distinctions so small they could only appear when no one was rushing. A woman named Ruth came in looking for ribbon for a granddaughter's costume. Louise invited her to the table, and all 3 of them spent 20 minutes opening drawers and laying strips of satin across the wood to compare width and color. No one treated the time as wasted. Calvin realized, with quiet surprise, that this kind of unhurried usefulness felt better than the old decisive kind. It left room for other people inside it. At home that evening, he sorted the junk drawer in the kitchen more slowly than usual and found himself smiling at the absurd number of spare keys they had collected. Louise noticed the difference in him, but did not make much of it. She simply handed him a small tin of buttons from her own sewing basket the next week and asked whether the store might use them. By early spring, Calvin was running the sewing room table every Thursday morning. He labeled shallow trays in neat handwriting and no longer measured success by how much had been cleared. He measured it by whether the room remained legible enough for someone to find what they needed without feeling hurried by his presence. That shift changed more than the volunteer work. He listened longer when his son, Daniel, called to describe roof repairs or school events involving the grandchildren. Calvin had once heard conversations mainly for the action points hidden inside them. Now he heard tone, pacing, and the way people sometimes need a few extra sentences before reaching what matters. The slower life had not dulled him. It had made him porous to finer grain. One afternoon, after Louise left for a dentist appointment, Calvin stayed alone in the sewing room and sorted a tin of mismatched cufflinks that had somehow landed among the notions. The tiny metal pieces clicked against each other, like loose thoughts. Sun warmed the table. Somewhere beyond the lace curtain, a customer laughed softly at something in the front room. Calvin looked down at the little silver and brass objects and felt no urge to rush them into order. For once, order was not the conquest of clutter. It was the patient discovery of relation. This one beside that one. A set beginning to appear. A room settling around one careful pair of hands. At the end of the boardwalk, where gulls often stood in a line facing inland for reasons no one could explain, Marianne wrapped a scarf tighter at her neck and watched the tide come in across the flats. She had visited the shore for years, but only recently begun arriving early enough to see the water change, before anyone else seemed to need the day. Marianne was 65, recently retired from a career in dental billing that had required relentless small accuracy, codes, claims, corrections, follow-ups. She spent decades inside systems that punished delay and rewarded persistence more than peace. Her husband, Julian, liked to joke that she could outlast any problem through sheer administrative resolve. It was affectionate and true. What neither of them fully recognized at the time was how thoroughly that rhythm entered the rest of life. Marianne ate fast, packed too much into weekends, turned vacations into orderly campaigns of activities designed not to miss a thing. Even at the shore, she once moved from walk to lunch to antique shop to scenic overlook with the purposeful efficiency of someone trying to justify being away. Then Julian had a minor knee issue one summer that made long active outings less appealing. They rented the same small cottage anyway. For lack of better options, Marianne began walking the boardwalk alone before breakfast, while Julian read in the kitchen with a blanket over his lap. She told herself the early walks were temporary. Instead, they became the real center of the trip. At first, she treated the walks as exercise. Steps counted, route repeated, pace maintained. But the ocean, unlike an office, offered no visible reward for speed. The tide moved on its own time. Birds lifted in loose groups, settled elsewhere, and did not care about efficiency. One morning, Marianne stopped near the rail because the sky over the water had turned a color she could not have named quickly. Grey and silver, then pale peach near the horizon. The change was gradual enough that any hurried mind would have missed the sequence entirely. She stood there far longer than she intended. The board beneath her shoes held the night's remaining dampness. A fisherman at the far corner adjusted his line and then simply watched. Marianne felt an unfamiliar easing in her chest. Not dramatic, just real. The early hour did not feel empty. It felt less edited than the rest of the day. Back at the cottage, she found Julian buttering toast. He looked up at her with the mild expression of a man who had not been surprised that his wife returned different from the walk. She sat at the table without immediately planning the day. The quiet between them held the sea air she had carried back in on her coat. Later in life, slowness can clarify scale. A person who has spent years managing paperwork, timelines, and practical demands may begin to feel that every hour must justify itself. The shore teaches otherwise. Light changes whether or not anyone records it. Water reaches the boards in increments too subtle to command, yet by noon the whole edge of the day has moved. Marianne began structuring the rest of the trip around that fact. Fewer stops, longer breakfasts, a single afternoon errand instead of 4. Julian, whose knee improved, still preferred the gentler schedule. He read while Marianne napped. They drove once to a farm stand and spent 20 minutes choosing peaches instead of treating the stand as a checkpoint on the way to something else. At home after the trip, the slower pattern followed her. She no longer turned Saturdays into compact campaigns against disorder. She still shopped and cleaned and answered messages, but she left room at the start of the morning for a cup of tea by the back door while the yard came into focus. Julian joined her sometimes with the newspaper folded under one arm. By autumn, Marianne understood that the boardwalk had not merely calmed her. It had corrected her sense of what a full day looked like. Fullness was not the same as density. A day could contain fewer events and more life. During their next shore visit, she returned to the rail before sunrise on 3 consecutive mornings. On the third, a line of gulls stood facing inland just as before. The tide rose. The boards darkened under mist. Marianne tucked her hands into her coat and felt no need to convert the scene into meaning beyond itself. That restraint was part of the clarity too. The slower life had taught her that not every good thing needed to be improved by analysis. Some things only needed enough time to appear. In the upstairs room of the senior center, where folding chairs were stacked along one wall and a piano sat with its lid permanently closed, Wilma joined a group every Friday afternoon to piece quilts for a shelter drive. She had sewn in practical ways all her life. Hems, curtains, school costumes, loose buttons. Quilting was different. It required the patience to make beauty from units too small to matter on their own. At 80, Wilma no longer drove after dark and no longer pretended to enjoy rushing. Yet the old habit of compression had not vanished entirely. She still folded errands close together, arrived early to appointments, and felt restless when others worked more slowly than she could have. She called this being organized. Often it was simply fear of slack. The quilting group was led, in the gentlest possible sense, by a woman named Beatrice, who never appeared troubled by unfinished work. Squares accumulated. Colors were tested, changed, retested. One seam had to be undone now and then. The room was full of minor reversals no one treated as failure. Wilma found this quietly radical. The first month she came, she tried to increase the pace by cutting several strips at once and stacking tasks in the way she once handled busy household Saturdays. Beatrice thanked her, and then spread the fabrics out on the table so everyone could look properly before sewing. Some combinations that seemed efficient in a stack looked dull when placed together. Others needed a slightly slower hand to align patterns that would otherwise drift. Wilma began to understand that the work was not only about completion, it was about relation. One piece beside another. One color softened by a second one. One person stitching while another ironed and a third stood by the window, deciding whether a border needed more blue. Her closest companion in the room became Felix, a widower who had taken up hand sewing because evenings had grown too long. He was patient in the manner of someone who had arrived at patience through necessity rather than temperament. Wilma sat across from him each week and found that the rhythm of his hands slowed her own. Neither hurried the other. They simply worked within the same calm. Later in life, pattern synthesis begins to emerge almost on its own. The slower life reveals that many things once treated as inefficiencies are actually conditions for coherence, waiting before choosing a fabric, listening through the full turn of another person's memory, letting a room of people settle into one another's pace. These do not obstruct meaning. They make it possible. One Friday, the group spread a nearly finished quilt across 3 tables pushed together. The squares were made from donated shirts, worn dresses, old aprons, and lengths of fabric no longer sold anywhere. No single patch carried the whole effect. Wilma stood looking down at the joined surface and felt a recognition extend beyond the quilt itself. So much of a later life was like this. Fragments once separated by urgency, beginning to read as one thing when enough time had passed and someone had been willing to arrange them carefully. After the session, Felix helped carry the quilt to the storage cabinet. Wilma noticed how neither of them moved with the apologetic speed older people sometimes adopt in public, as if to reassure the world they are not in the way. Their slowness was not frailty. It was measure. At home she made soup and let it cook on low, while evening darkened. She thought about the quilts lined up in the center's cupboard, each one assembled from pieces that might have looked trivial in isolation. The image stayed with her over the next few days. At the grocery store, while buttoning her coat, while trimming dead leaves from the plant on the landing. By the 19th and 20th stories of this episode's movement, the theme had grown clearer in ways Wilma herself would not have phrased as a theme. Slowing down had not reduced life to smaller ambitions. It had made relation visible. Relation between moments, between people, between one plain task and another. Under haste, days appear as separate errands and interruptions. Under a slower gaze, they begin to resemble joined cloth. The following Friday, she returned to the quilting room before anyone else and stood in the quiet, with her hand resting on the back of a folding chair. Outside, rain tapped against the high windows. Inside, the room waited. Wilma did not feel the urge to get ahead of the hour. She was content to let the others arrive, let the fabrics be unfolded, let the afternoon take shape at the pace required to hold it together. That was the clarity now entering the later stretch of life, not the clarity of answers. Pattern. Enough to see that what once looked like delay had often been the very thing that allowed meaning to stay stitched in place. In a room above the community center, where the tables were covered in brown paper and the windows fogged lightly from kettles downstairs, Bernadette shaped clay with both hands and tried not to hurry the bowl into symmetry. She was 72 and still knew enough to pottery that every piece carried the visible record of her impatience. For most of her adult life, Bernadette had been known for finishing things. She taught bookkeeping in a small adult education program, kept a neat house, and returned borrowed dishes cleaner than she received them. She was not severe. She was simply fast in the way competent people often are when they have spent years proving they can keep a life in order. Her husband, Alden, had retired a few years before she did and seemed to settle into slowness with suspicious ease. He buttered toast evenly, read 2 pages of a newspaper, and then looked out the window for no reason Bernadette could respect. He took evening walks without needing a destination. Bernadette loved him, but for a long time she thought his pace belonged to a kind of fortunate innocence. Then she signed up for a pottery class because her friend Lucinda said working with clay made the mind quieter. Bernadette doubted this. She suspected the class would simply expose how awkward her hands were with unfamiliar work. On the first day, she tried to shape a cup in one continuous effort and collapsed its rim twice. Lucinda, whose own piece leaned slightly and seemed unbothered by it, laughed softly under her breath and began again. Now, months later, Bernadette still felt the old urge rise whenever the wheel turned. She wanted the bowl to reveal progress quickly. She wanted the walls to lift and hold. She wanted the work to look finished before she had fully entered it. The clay resisted that kind of will. It widened when her thumbs pushed too hard. It slumped when she tried to correct too much at once. Across the table, Lucinda rolled a coil of clay between her palms and spoke only now and then. Their friendship had grown in the spaces around the work rather than through forceful disclosure. Sometimes they discussed ordinary groceries, sometimes old jobs, sometimes nothing at all. The room itself seemed to prefer a slower arrangement of people, a brush set down, a small sponge squeezed over the sink, footsteps on the stair, and then quiet again. Bernadette found that if she stopped trying to make the bowl perfect in the first 10 minutes, she could begin to see what the clay was already offering. One side wanted to open a little wider. The base needed more patience than pressure. The work was not vague. It was exact in a calmer register than her old habits recognized. Later in life, slowness often clarifies the difference between control and relation. Bernadette had spent decades making respectable things happen through effort, timing, and intelligent compression. Clay showed her another truth. Some forms appear only when the hand stops trying to command every stage of their arrival. After class, she and Lucinda sat on the center's back steps with paper cups of tea. The parking lot held patches of old snow in the shade, and someone in the gym below them bounced a ball that echoed up through the brick. Bernadette used to treat this hour as expendable. Drive home, start dinner, move the day along. Instead, she sat with the unfinished bowl cooling somewhere upstairs on a shelf and let the afternoon remain incomplete. When she got home, Alden was in the kitchen slicing pears with the same patient precision that had once irritated her. She watched the knife move through the fruit and realized his pace had not been ignorance after all. It had been a kind of fluency. He understood, earlier than she did, that not every good thing improves under acceleration. By spring, Bernadette's bowls were still slightly irregular, though now the irregularity looked deliberate enough to be welcomed. She no longer measured the class by how many finished pieces came home. She measured it by the way her shoulders lowered at the wheel, by how often the rest of the day stayed calmer after 2 hours with her hands in the same cool, patient material. The slower life had not reduced her competence. It had refined her use of it. A bowl could lean a little and still be true. An afternoon could remain unoptimized and still feel complete. In the old tempo, she had respected only what could be brought to order quickly. In the newer one, she was beginning to respect whatever required time in order to become itself. On weekday mornings, Samuel stopped at the same diner after his walk and took the booth by the window even when the counter seats were open and service would have been faster there. At 74, he had only recently learned that quick service was not always the same as a better hour. For most of his life, Samuel ate in transit. Toast over the sink before work, sandwiches at a desk, coffee swallowed while searching for keys. He managed a warehouse for decades and took pride in how little time he wasted between tasks. Hunger was handled the way shipping errors were handled, efficiently, without sentiment. The food itself was almost beside the point. His daughter, Maren, used to tease him gently about it. When she was younger, she watched him cut pancakes into exact squares and finish breakfast before anyone else had settled properly into the meal. Samuel would smile and say he liked to get moving. It sounded harmless. Only later did he understand that he had trained himself to move through even the pleasant parts of living as if they were narrow corridors towards something more urgent. After retirement, the habits remained. He still stood while eating an apple, still reheated soup and consumed it with one eye on nothing in particular. Then one winter, his neighbor Celeste asked whether he wanted to join her for coffee after their morning walk around the lake path. Samuel agreed out of politeness more than desire. He assumed the coffee would take 10 minutes and then the day could continue. Instead, Celeste chose the diner with the slow windows and the waitress who seemed to have known everyone in town for 30 years. She ordered oatmeal and let it cool properly. She looked outside between sentences. Samuel found himself slowing by imitation before he believed in the value of it. Now he came alone some mornings as well. He ordered eggs or oatmeal or toast with jam and sat where the light changed on the tabletop over the course of the meal. The booth by the window brought the outside in without demanding anything from him. A mail truck stopping at the curb. A pair of school children crossing with oversized backpacks. Wind lifting a newspaper page from the gutter and carrying it a few feet before dropping it again. None of it would have counted, in his earlier framework, as meaningful use of time. Yet the hour in the diner often steadied the entire day. Samuel could feel the difference when he ate too fast at home. The mind stayed narrow and slightly forward-leaning, as if braced for instructions. At the diner, with the plate arriving, cooling, and emptying in its own sequence, the morning gathered a clearer shape. Later in life, slowness often clarifies the role of ordinary rituals. They are not decorations around the real business of living. They are part of what teaches the mind how to inhabit the day. Samuel had long imagined that small comforts could wait until work was done. Work had been done many times over, and still he carried the unfinished tension of those years. The slower breakfast began loosening something no major milestone had touched. One Tuesday, Maren met him there before heading to an appointment across town. She slid into the booth with a scarf still tucked into her coat and smiled when she saw the full breakfast in front of him. Samuel noticed that he did not rush through it just because his daughter was there. He stayed with the meal and with her presence at the same time. The conversation wandered from her son's science fair project to the odd tenderness of early spring mud. Nothing needed solving. No task sat underneath the talk, waiting to be extracted. That afternoon, Samuel came home and sliced an orange at the kitchen counter with the same measured pace he used at the diner. The change looked small from the outside. Yet he understood that the pace of a meal can alter the pace of thought. It can return a person to sequence. Cup, spoon, window, companion, silence. One thing followed by another, in a way that makes the hour legible. By the time warmer weather arrived, the diner booth had become part of his week. Not every day, not a compulsion, just a chosen place where the morning was allowed to arrive before being used. Celeste still joined him some days. Other days he sat alone and watched light move across the salt shaker while his coffee cooled enough to drink slowly. The slower life was not taking anything from Samuel that mattered. It was giving weight back to moments he once skimmed on the way to elsewhere. Even breakfast, he now saw, had been part of the life he thought was happening later. At 3 in the afternoon, when the library was between the school rush and the evening quiet, Hester rode the crosstown bus with no destination more urgent than the far terminal and back. She was 70 and did this once a week, usually on Wednesdays, after leaving a stack of returned books at the circulation desk where she volunteered. If anyone had asked what purpose the ride served, Hester would have struggled to answer in terms her younger self respected. It was not shopping, not an appointment, not exercise in the formal sense. It was simply a slow passage through familiar streets, seen from a pace she could not control. In middle age, Hester hated buses. She considered them imprecise and slightly humiliating, signs that a person had not managed life efficiently enough to drive directly where needed. She worked in office administration and arranged her days with clipped competence. Leave by 8:15. Park by 8:40. Lunch at noon. Errands stacked on the way home. There was comfort in that clean architecture. There was also a hidden cost. She rarely saw any place except as a route between obligations. Her older brother, Noel, never learned to drive and spent years on buses without apology. Hester used to find his stories strangely soft. He would mention the way afternoon light hit the windows on the east side of town, or how a woman in a green coat always got off near the bakery with a paper sack held to her chest like something warm. Hester listened politely and assumed he had too much idle time. Now Noel was the one who first suggested the Wednesday ride. He had come by after one of Hester's library shifts and found her standing in the kitchen as though the day had ended before she had fully entered it. He proposed coffee at the terminal cafe. Hester almost declined. Then she went, and the bus changed the shape of the afternoon in ways she did not expect. The ride itself asked very little. Sit, look out, stop when the bus stops, move when it moves. The streets she had driven for years appeared different from that slower height. Front porches became scenes rather than background. A barber sweeping hair from the threshold. 2 girls comparing something on a phone at a bench. Tulips just beginning in a strip of soil outside the pharmacy. Hester realized how long she had been crossing her own town without inhabiting it. Noel sat beside her on the route out and usually took the seat behind her on the return so he could stretch one knee. Their companionship was gentle and practical. At the terminal, they drank weak coffee from paper cups and watched drivers change shifts. Neither tried to make the outing more impressive than it was. That modesty may have been what Hester trusted most. Nothing about the ride needed a grand explanation to be worth doing. Later in life, slowness often clarifies that attention is shaped by the speed of passage. A town seen through a windshield becomes a diagram. The same town seen through a bus window, with no responsibility to steer or optimize, becomes a sequence of actual human worlds. Hester had thought faster transit made life larger. In many ways, it had made it thinner. On weeks when Noel could not join her, she still took the ride. She sat near the middle, held the pole when the bus lurched, and watched the neighborhoods pass in quiet bands. Brick apartments, small yards, a corner store with hand-painted fruit on the window. The repetition itself became comforting. A person could travel without chasing novelty and still feel the mind widen. Back at home after one of those rides, Hester found that chores no longer arrived with the same compressed pressure. She unpacked groceries more slowly, let the kettle finish before pouring. Stood at the sink long enough to watch the alley darken behind the building. The bus had not solved anything in the dramatic sense. It had simply returned sequence to a part of the week that used to disappear under task stacking. By late autumn, the driver on the Wednesday route began greeting Hester with a slight nod of recognition. She appreciated the familiarity without needing it to become conversation. The slower life, as it unfolded in these small habits, did not isolate her from the world. It placed her inside it more accurately. Streets, riders, windows, weather, Noel's careful step on the bus stairs, the terminal coffee cooling between her palms. None of it was wasted time. It was time seen at human speed. Noel sometimes pointed out buildings Hester had forgotten she recognized, not to test her, but to widen the ride. The old bakery that used to scent the whole block in winter. The apartment with the iron balcony where a woman once kept geraniums year-round. Hester listened and watched the windows pass. In the small room behind the tailor shop, where a single lamp threw yellow light over chalk, scissors, and folded lengths of cloth, Matteo pressed the iron more slowly than he once would have tolerated. The steam lifted in brief white threads and vanished against the hanging jackets. At 68, he had begun to understand that some work grows finer when it is allowed to keep its own pace. Matteo had inherited the shop from an uncle who believed speed reassured customers. Alterations promised by Friday. Hems done by the afternoon, buttons replaced while a person waited if possible. Matteo admired that ethic and lived by it for years. He liked the visible efficiency of it. Garments came in wrinkled, loose, unfinished in some small way, and left corrected. It gave the day a clean spine. His sister, Paloma, ran the front counter 3 mornings a week and had a different relationship to time. She pinned receipts carefully to hangers, looked customers in the eye, and never seemed embarrassed by pauses. Matteo used to suspect she did not fully grasp the pressure of keeping a small business alive. Later, he realized she grasped something else with greater precision. People remember how they are received as much as how quickly a seam is closed. One rainy afternoon, a woman brought in her late husband's coat and asked whether the lining could be repaired so her grandson might wear it. Matteo did not linger over the story. He took the measurements, gave the pickup date, and turned to the next task. Yet when he laid the coat on the table, the work refused to become routine. The fabric was older, softer, and slightly worn at the cuff in a way that made haste feel wrong. He found himself smowing. He unpicked the damaged seam with unusual care. He examined the old stitching pattern before deciding how to mend it. The slowness did not come from hesitation. It came from a clearer sense of what the coat required. Paloma stepped into the workroom once or twice with fresh tags and saw at once that something in her brother's manner had changed. He was not dragging. He was attending. From then on, Matteo began building a little more room into each day. 10 minutes between fittings. one garment at a time on the table instead of two stacked at his elbow. He discovered that many of his old rushes were not demanded by the work itself. They were demanded by the version of himself that wanted constant proof of usefulness. Later in life, slowness often clarifies the difference between throughput and care. Matteo had spent years collapsing the two into one idea. When he worked faster, he assumed he cared more. The coat lining showed him otherwise. Some forms of care are nearly invisible except in the steadiness of the hand that offers them. The change reached beyond the shop. Matteo stopped swallowing lunch in the back room while standing over the cutting table. He and Paloma began eating soup together near the front window once a week when business was light. They watched pedestrians step around puddles and spoke about family in the loose, unhurried way that had been missing from years when both of them were always half-turned toward the next customer. One Saturday, his niece Inez came by with a dress that needed the shoulder seams adjusted before a recital. Matteo pinned it while she stood very straight on the platform. He noticed how gently Paloma spoke to the girl from the counter, not to distract her, but to keep the room easy. When Inez left, Matteo sat with the dress for a minute before sewing. He understood that slowness in the shop was changing not only the garments, but the atmosphere around them. By winter, he still completed the week's work. Bills still had to be paid. Customers still liked reliability. Yet the room behind the tailor shop felt less like a place where time was chased, and more like a place where time was handled. Iron, cloth, thread, steam. Paloma's footsteps from the front room. A clock that ticked without accusation. The slower life had not weakened Matteo's craft. It had brought him closer to the very qualities he once believed only speed could defend. Accuracy, grace, enough space for a thing to be mended without being hurried past its meaning. She also began noticing the room itself. The weight of the iron cooling upright on its heel. The dull shine of the shears. The way afternoon light found the chalk dust on black cloth and made even that temporary mark look careful. Those details had always been present. Speed had merely pushed them to the edge of notice. On Sundays, before anyone else arrived for the family meal, Liesel stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand and let the soup come to itself. The apartment filled slowly with the smell of onions, celery, and the mild sweetness of carrots softening in broth. At 76, Liesel no longer believed that turning the heat higher was a respectable answer to impatience. For decades, she cooked the way she handled nearly everything, efficiently with 2 burners going and a third thought already reaching toward dessert or dishes or tomorrow's errands. She raised 3 children in a small house where meals had to be substantial and timely. There was real honor in that labor. Yet even after the children were grown and Sundays became gentler, her body continued to move through preparation as if a late pot of soup might undo the order of the world. Her grandson, Emile, often arrived early to help carry bread, though his help was uneven and his conversation wandered. When he was little, Liesel viewed this as a charming complication. Now that he was 16, quieter, and stretched awkwardly into his own height, she began to see that his early arrival was a form of trust. He liked the kitchen before the others came, the soft beginning of the meal, the part where nothing had yet become noisy. One February Sunday, he came in from the stairwell, shaking rain from his coat sleeves, and found Liesel standing still before the pot, not stirring, not chopping, simply watching the surface gather tiny movements before the first full boil. Emile set the bread down and asked no question. He stood beside her until the soup changed from silence to sound. Liesel realized how uncommon that kind of shared pause had been in her earlier life. There were always lunches to pack, roast to monitor, potatoes to mash. Cooking had been folded so tightly into duty that she rarely entered the sensory shape of it. Steam on her face, the click of the burner settling, parsley scent released under the knife. She did not regret feeding her family. She regretted how often the pace made the care feel invisible even to herself. Now she kept Sundays slower on purpose. She chopped vegetables before the stock pot was hot. She let beans soften fully instead of nudging the heat upward. She set the table in 2 stages. Plates first, then a pause, then glasses. Her daughter Rena noticed this before anyone spoke of it. She came in carrying a cake and found her mother and son standing at the sink trimming green beans with the unhurried rhythm of people not trying to get past the work. Later in life, slowness often clarifies what nourishment includes. Food is not only flavor or fuel, it is sequence, atmosphere, the pace at which a room begins to gather itself. Liesel had once protected the family meal by working faster. Now she was protecting it by refusing to. The soup that day was not especially different from the soups she had made for 40 years. Yet the kitchen was. Emil asked her how long the noodles should rest after cooking. Rena leaned against the counter with her sleeves rolled up and watched rain track down the window. Someone downstairs used practice scales on a piano. The meal began before anyone sat down, simply because the room had been given time to become a room. After lunch, when the plates were stacked and the apartment had fallen into the soft disorder that follows a shared meal, Liesel did not rush to clear every trace of it. She covered the soup, left the bread knife where it was for a while, and sat at the table with Emil while he described a book assignment in a tone that suggested he did not mind her asking follow-up questions. In earlier years, she might have listened from the sink. The sink could wait. By spring, the slower Sundays had become part of the family's understanding without anyone needing to formalize them. Rena came earlier. Emil sliced bread more carefully. Even the conversations seemed to arrive with less collision. The slower life, as Liesel now knew it, was not a retreat from love or usefulness. It was the form those things took once there was enough room to notice them. A pot simmering, a grandson lingering, rain on the window, the meal deepening before it was served. Sometimes, before the others rang the bell, she laid a spoon on each folded napkin and then stood back to look at the table, as if it belonged to someone else for a moment. The stillness before arrival had become part of the nourishment too. It let the meal gather shape before voices and chairs and laughter filled it in. In the den at the back of the house, where shelves of records leaned in careful alphabetical rows and the rug held the faint smell of old paper and cedar, Clifton lowered the needle onto an album and sat down before the first notes arrived. He was 79 and had begun listening to music in complete sides again, which for him was less a hobby than a correction. In the years when work and family were busiest, Clifton loved music the way hurried people often do. In fragments, a song while shaving, half a concerto while paying bills, jazz under the sound of dishes and children coming through the door. The music remained present, but mostly as atmosphere. It brightened tasks. It softened rooms. It did not often receive the full shape of his attention. His wife, Nadira, had always listened differently. She knew when an arrangement opened up after the second chorus. She heard how a singer held one syllable a fraction longer the second time through. Clifton admired this, but placed it in the category of luxuries available to gentler temperaments. He was an engineer. He dealt in schedules, tolerances, and problems that wanted solving before lunch. Then one autumn evening, a storm knocked the power out for several hours. With the television dark and the house temporarily freed from its usual layers of interruption, Nadira suggested they play a record on the small battery-powered turntable their son had given them as a novelty. Clifton almost laughed at the impracticality of this. Then the first track began, and the room changed. There was nothing else to do but listen. Rain on the windows, the soft mechanical turn of the platter, an old voice he knew by heart suddenly sounding less familiar because he was hearing it whole. Clifton felt a kind of embarrassment at how long it had been since he had given anything this much uninterrupted attention that was not a problem or obligation. After the power returned, something of that slower evening remained. He began choosing one record in the late afternoon and listening to both sides from beginning to end. Nadira joined him often, knitting or simply resting her hands in her lap. Some days they spoke between tracks. Some days they did not. The silence never felt like emptiness. It felt like part of the composition of the room. Later in life, slowness often clarifies that appreciation cannot be rushed without becoming thinner than the thing appreciated. Clifton had always believed he was making efficient use of beauty by fitting it around the edges of practical life. What he discovered in the den was that beauty has edges of its own, and they are worth entering intact. The records called up decades without forcing nostalgia into the center. A brass section he had loved in college. A piano phrase Nadira once played constantly while their first child napped. Yet the past did not feel like the main subject. The real change lay in how the music restructured the present hour. One side of an album asked the body to remain, to let one track lead into another, to stop treating every pause as an opportunity to stand up and improve something. Their daughter Sophia visited one Saturday and found both parents sitting quietly while an orchestral piece unfolded across the room. She lowered herself into the armchair without speaking and stayed through the end of the side. Clifton noticed that he did not feel compelled to explain what they were doing or why the record mattered. The slowness itself seemed legible. Afterward, the three of them had tea in the kitchen, and Clifton could tell the conversation had been shaped by the listening. No one rushed to fill the spaces. Details emerged with more ease. Sophia described her son's habit of sorting pebbles by color on the back steps. Nadira laughed softly at the seriousness of this. Clifton listened as though the story itself were another track that deserved a full hearing. By winter, the den had become a small school of attention. Needle, static, first note, the arc of a side, the turning over, the subtle reset. The slower life had not made Clifton less alert to the world. It had trained alertness away from urgency and toward form. He was beginning to hear, in music and beyond it, that clarity often arrives not when life is sped up enough to master, but when it is slowed enough to be fully received. He even noticed the silence after the needle lifted. Not an absence exactly. More like the room remembering what it had just held. That small after-sound stayed with him into the kitchen, into washing cups, into the slower arrangement of the rest of the evening. At dusk, when the heat of the day finally eased off the brick, Odessa carried 2 cane chairs onto the front stoop and sat with her neighbor Marcel until the street turned from gold to gray. They had lived 4 doors apart for 12 years, and only in the last 3 had become part of each other's ordinary week. Odessa was 69 and had spent most of adult life keeping evenings compressed. Dinner, cleanup, tomorrow's clothes, a little television, bed. She was not unhappy. She was simply efficient in the way a person becomes after years of managing other people's needs first. She worked in school nutrition, raised 2 sons, and learned to regard any unused strip of time as something slightly shameful. Marcel, a widower who repaired accordions and old lamps out of his garage, had a slower instinct. He watered the same fern each evening and then sat outside as if the block itself required witness. Odessa used to wave from her steps and keep moving. The stoop seemed to her like a place for people with more leisure than she could justify. Then one summer, her younger son, Darius, visited and mentioned, without criticism, that the house always felt as though it were between tasks. Odessa heard the remark more clearly than he intended. Even on peaceful evenings, she remained tilted toward the next necessity. After Darius left, she carried one chair outside with a glass of water and sat down almost defensively, as if to prove the block offered nothing she needed. Marcel lifted a hand from his own stoop and did not intrude. That restraint made it easier to return the next night. Now they sat together several evenings a week, sometimes on her steps, sometimes on his. Children rode scooters in looping patterns before being called in. A man from the corner house washed his car too late in the day and never seemed bothered by the light fading. The mail carrier's truck passed with its thin, metallic rattle. Odessa discovered that a street reveals itself differently when a person stops crossing it only to get somewhere else. She and Marcel did not discuss heavy subjects often. He told stories about old lamp parts and once about a radio that smelled faintly of cigar smoke when warmed by the bulb inside. Odessa described her granddaughter's fascination with birds and her own uncertain attempt to keep herbs alive in 3 dented pots. The talk moved gently, without performance. The stoop itself seemed to keep everyone in scale. Later in life, slowness often clarifies the social life of a place. Under haste, a street is noise, traffic, interruption. One more thing between indoors and elsewhere. Under a slower gaze, it becomes a pattern of recurring lives. Odessa had lived among these houses for years without truly entering that pattern. She knew addresses. She did not know evening. One August night, Darius came by again and found his mother sitting beside Marcel with 2 plates of sliced peaches balanced on their knees. He looked almost startled by the sight, though pleased. Odessa realized then how much of her older love had been expressed through motion. Cooking, folding, reminding, driving, sending. Sitting still in visible company felt, to her surprise, like another form of provision. As the months passed, the stoop changed with the weather. Summer insects, then dry leaves skittering at the curb. Then the first evenings when both chairs needed blankets laid across the backs before anyone sat down. Marcel sometimes brought a small lamp outside and set it on the step between them. Odessa liked the modest pool of light it made, just enough to keep their hands visible, not enough to defeat the dark. The slower life had not left her with less to do. Laundry still waited. Breakfast still needed thinking about. But the evening no longer collapsed into utility. The hour on the stoop gave the rest of the night more room around it. Dishes could be washed after. Towels could be folded later. The sky only dimmed once each day, and she had been missing it for years. By the time winter approached, Odessa understood that the stoop had become one of the clearest parts of her week. Not because anything grand occurred there, because nothing needed to. A neighbor, 2 chairs, a street settling into night. The mild relief of no longer proving that every minute must be driven toward a result. Clarity had arrived in the ordinary company of remaining where she was until the day could be seen ending. Some nights they spoke less than others. Odessa had stopped worrying that silence might make the visit seem thin. The silence was part of the visit. Crickets starting up, porch bulbs clicking on one by one, the whole block lowering itself into evening around them. In late January, When the light was thin by 4 o'clock and the yard seemed months away from offering anything but bare stems and damp soil, Armand spread seed catalogues across the dining table and read them as slowly as some people read letters from old friends. He was 77 and had reached the stage of life where planning the garden felt almost as nourishing as the garden itself. When Armand was younger, planting season arrived as a campaign. Beds cleared in one weekend, stakes set, seeds ordered fast and in practical varieties. He worked at the post office then, carried the tempo of the sorting room home with him, and treated the yard as one more place where results should show quickly if enough effort was applied. Vegetables, yes. Flowers only if there was room at the edge. His sister Delphine, who lived 2 streets over and came for supper every Thursday, always handled gardens differently. She walked the nursery paths twice before choosing a single plant. She crouched to look at labels as if they contained minor literature. Armand loved her, but for years he considered her method charmingly inefficient. The ground did not care, he thought, whether a person pondered a bean variety for 10 extra minutes. Then came the seasons when his knees asked for a slower bend and his stamina shortened in honest ways. The old weekend campaigns left him sore and oddly dissatisfied. He could still force a yard into order, but the forcing took so much of his attention that he missed the quiet satisfaction that had drawn him outdoors in the first place. So he began changing the year at its beginning rather than at its height. In winter, he sat with the catalogues and planned fewer rows. He looked at spacing. He considered what colors would appear in sequence near the back fence. He thought about where Delphine liked to sit with her tea in June and whether a taller stand of cosmos might soften the view of the alley gate from that chair. The dining room table became a place of slower anticipation. Envelopes from seed companies, a pencil, reading glasses pushed up and then lowered again. Delphine at the opposite end with her own catalogue, occasionally passing one over because she had found a tomato described in language too beautiful to be practical. Armand still smiled at that, but now he read the description too. Sweet, late bearing, striped shoulders, thin skin. Words could slow a person into care before a single seed touched soil. Later in life, slowness often clarifies that preparation is part of the life itself, rather than merely the cost of reaching it. Armand had spent years trying to get to the bloom, the harvest, the visible proof. The winter table showed him another pleasure, the measured imagining of what a season might become when not overcrowded. By spring, the changes were plain. Fewer seedlings, wider gaps, more flowers among the beans. A bench moved 6 feet to catch the better light. Delphine came over to help plant onion sets, and neither of them hurried the job. They stood, stretched, bent again, and let the afternoon include pauses. A robin worked the lawn near the hose. Somewhere down the block, a hammer tapped at a rhythm too patient to be construction and too steady to ignore. Armand noticed that the garden now gave him company from more angles, not only through the work, but through the thinking before it, the waiting after watering, the way Delphine would arrive with a paper sack of rolls and sit beside the first tulips as if attendance itself mattered. He had once believed slowing down in the yard would mean accepting less produce, less ambition, less proof that he still had strength. Instead, it gave him proportion, enough rows to tend without resentment, enough flowers to make the fence line look forgiving, enough room for the season to be witnessed as well as managed. In August, he carried a bowl of beans and marigolds to the kitchen and set them on the counter without immediately cleaning either one. He stood there, looking at the accidental beauty of the colors, together and thought of the winter table, the catalogues, Delphine's careful finger on a page. The slower life had not delayed the season. It had entered it earlier, at the point of imagining, and stayed with it long enough for the whole thing to feel less like a task and more like a patient unfolding. At first, he worried that friends would see the wider spacing and assume he was yielding to age. Then the first zinnias opened between the beanpoles, and the whole argument seemed to dissolve. The garden looked less crowded, more legible, and somehow more generous to anyone walking through it. On rainy afternoons, Florence opened the cedar chest in her spare room and sorted photographs into shallow trays she had labeled by decade, though the decades were less precise than the lives they tried to hold. At 75, she had discovered that going slowly through old photographs changed more than memory. It altered the pace of the present room. She had always been the family keeper of objects. School certificates, recipe cards, postcards, extra house keys, the buttons that came sewn inside coats and were never used until one vanished years later. In earlier life, she handled this role with a speed that made it look effortless. Put things away, create order, know where everything belonged. Memory itself became one more practical system to maintain. Her younger brother Lionel, who visited on Tuesdays, had a looser relation to storage and often arrived with pockets full of receipts or bits of twine he claimed might still be useful. Florence once found this exasperating. Now, with both of them older and the stakes of tidiness reduced, his unstructured way of remembering had started to interest her. He did not file life, he revisited it. The photograph project began after Florence found 3 loose envelopes tucked behind winter blankets in the cedar chest. One held family snapshots. Another contained duplicate prints of a trip she could barely date. The third contained pictures with names on the back in her mother's hand, written slowly enough to suggest that naming people was part of preserving them. Florence set them on the bed, intending to organize them in an hour. The hour stretched into afternoon because each image asked to be looked at longer than expected. There was her father in shirt sleeves beside a car too old now to seem impressive. Lionel at 12 holding a fish with more solemnity than triumph. Florence herself at a kitchen table, young and already arranging plates while others laughed around her. She noticed, not for the first time, how often she appeared in old photographs mid-task, carrying, straightening, turning toward the next necessity before the moment had fully settled. Now Lionel came on Tuesdays and helped in his own unmethodical way. He would take one print from the tray and hold it near the lamp, searching not only for the year, but for the feeling around it. Which apartment? Which holiday? Whether their aunt was still using the cane in those days or not yet. Florence used to think this was exactly how people failed to finish anything. Lately, she had begun to see that finishing was not the only honor due to a record of a life. Later in life, slowness often clarifies that memory is not a warehouse. It is a field of associations, best entered with patience. Florence had kept family history safe for years by organizing it. She was only now learning how to keep it alive by dwelling in it without rushing to the next envelope. The spare room itself changed under that slower habit. Rain against the window. The cedar smell rising whenever the chest was open. Lionel in the chair by the lamp, sometimes smiling at a picture before he remembered to explain why. Florence no longer treated the sessions as archival work to be completed efficiently. She made tea first. She left the trays out until evening if the light was good. She allowed one photograph to occupy 10 minutes when 10 minutes was what it asked for. What surprised her most was how the slowness touched current relationships. Lionel told fuller stories when not hurried toward conclusions. Florence listened more gently and corrected dates less often. The photographs had become an excuse for a better pace between them, one that did not depend on having unresolved conflict or grand confessions to justify tenderness. By the end of March, she had sorted only part of the chest, far less than her younger self would have accepted. Yet the work no longer felt behind. It felt inhabited. A box of wedding prints, a tray of summer trips, a small stack still waiting by the lamp, because Lionel thought one woman in the background might be their cousin's neighbor from the old duplex, and Florence was not entirely sure he was wrong. The slower life had not turned her away from order. It had taught her that order without pause can flatten the very thing it means to preserve. The photographs did not need only labels. They needed room, rain outside, tea cooling, her brother's voice taking the long route to a remembered afternoon. In that room, with the trays open and time no longer treated like an adversary, Florence could feel clarity arriving through patience rather than control. In the sitting room by the west window, where the last light reached the puzzle table only for an hour each evening, Thomas and Celia worked on the same 1,000-piece landscape for nearly 3 weeks without any intention of speeding it up. At 78 and 74, they had come to enjoy the part of life that moved by accretion rather than conquest. Earlier in marriage, they would never have tolerated such a pace. Thomas taught science and treated projects as things to move through with visible progress. Celia ran a catering business from home for years and learned to regard every surface as temporary staging for the next demand. Even leisure often arrived as a task in better clothing. Trips planned tightly. Games played competitively. A puzzle, if started at all, would have been a weekend operation meant to prove efficiency under the disguise of fun. The landscape puzzle came from their granddaughter Nora, who chose it because the picture showed a coastline at dusk, and she thought the colors looked peaceful. Thomas emptied the box onto the felt board, expecting to sort the edge pieces immediately and finish most of it within days. Celia sat down opposite him and began turning pieces picture side up, one by one, not to get ahead, but to enjoy the small revelations of color and shape. Her pace changed his before either one remarked on it. The puzzle settled into the house as a kind of low, steady presence. Breakfast dishes done. 1 or 2 pieces placed. Late afternoon tea. 3 more pieces. Some evenings, none at all, because the light made green look too much like grey, and both of them preferred to wait. The work did not suffer from this. It deepened. The coastline gradually appeared. A cluster of windows in a distant house. The pale path down the cliffside. The water that first looked uniformly blue and then divided itself into shades. Later in life, slowness often clarifies what steady companionship actually is. Not constant conversation, not dramatic declarations. Often it is 2 people returning to the same unfinished thing with no resentment that it remains unfinished. Thomas and Celia found that the puzzle gathered their evenings without forcing them into entertainment. Their son, Victor, stopped by one Thursday and laughed softly when he saw how little of the sky had been completed after more than a week. Thomas almost explained that they had both been busy. Then he stopped. Busy with what? Tea. A walk. Reading in separate chairs. Celia, trimming basil in the kitchen. The truth was that they had not rushed because there was no need to. Victor stood there a moment longer and seemed to understand more than the surface of the table showed. The puzzle also altered the silence between them. In earlier years, Thomas often felt that an evening needed shape supplied from the outside. Plans, television, errands, something decisive. Now he could sit with Celia and search the blue pieces without requiring the room to prove itself more exciting than it was. She could find one piece and set it in place without commentary. He could hold up another, consider it, and put it back. Their attention moved in parallel more than in conversation. And that parallelness felt like an earned kind of peace. The west window became part of the ritual. At a certain hour, The light hit the puzzle board and clarified the difference between lavender shadow and deepening water. Celia noticed this first. Thomas began timing his tea to it. Some evenings they said almost nothing while the light changed, and a few more pieces found their proper relation. Then the room dimmed, and they left the rest for tomorrow without frustration. By the time the coastline was nearly complete, Thomas understood that the puzzle had been teaching him something his faster years would never have recognized as knowledge. Completion is only one form of satisfaction. Another lies in the repeated return, the mild concentration, the visible but unforced assembling of parts into pattern. The same truth seemed to apply beyond the cardboard, to marriage, to evenings, to older age itself. When the final section of sky remained, Celia did not hurry to finish, even though the box lid picture made the solution plain enough. She liked having one corner still open, one calm problem left on the table. Thomas, to his own surprise, liked it too. The slower life had not made either of them passive. It had changed what counted as progress. Not how fast the image appeared, but how gently the days around it had been lived while it did. By the later stretch of the episode, the pattern had become quiet enough to be trusted. Nothing dramatic had been required. No large renunciations. No grand losses accepted for the sake of wisdom. What changed, across these many rooms and kitchens and sidewalks and work tables, was often only tempo. A hand pausing over clay. Soup left to simmer without force. A bus ride taken without the pressure of destination. A puzzle allowed to stay unfinished long enough to become part of the life around it. The older adults moving through these hours were not retreating from the world. In many cases, they were entering it more fully than they had when they were faster. Earlier life had trained them toward compression for understandable reasons. Children needed things. Jobs depended on timing. Money, appointments, and obligations formed the rough architecture of many years. Speed, in those periods, could look like devotion. It could look like competence, even kindness. It solved real problems. It built households. It met deadlines. It kept ordinary life from slipping too far out of hand. Yet later on, when the pressure eased or changed shape, many of them found that the speed remained after the necessity had thinned. The body still rose in a rush. Meals still disappeared too quickly. Walks were still taken as if pursued from behind. Even pleasure could be hurried until it turned thin. Books finished without settling. Music heard without being received. A street crossed without ever becoming a place. What the slower life revealed was not emptiness, but detail. The structure of a morning light. The sequence of a meal. The texture of conversation when no one was trying to get through it and on to the next thing. Slowness made relation visible. Between one task and another. Between weather and mood. Between two people who had long loved each other, but had often expressed that love mainly through motion. Between a person and the town, room, yard, kitchen, or porch that had been surrounding them for years while attention looked elsewhere. Again and again, the clarity arrived not as a lesson pronounced from above, but as a felt correction in ordinary time. A diner booth by the window, a stool in a tailoring room, seed catalogues spread across a table, photographs under a lamp on a rainy afternoon. The world did not grow larger through spectacle. It grew clearer through sequence. One thing seen long enough for another thing to appear beside it. One pause permitting the mind to notice what constant movement had blurred. There was also, underneath many of these stories, a gentler revision of what usefulness meant. earlier usefulness often came through speed, quick repairs, efficient meals, immediate replies, rapid completion. Later usefulness could look different, listening all the way to the end of another person's thought, giving a room enough time to gather, letting the work itself indicate its proper pace, accepting that some forms of care are nearly invisible if measured only by output. The slower life did not strip dignity from labor. It often returned dignity to the conditions under which labor was offered. In this way, nothing essential was lost. Some illusions may have been. The illusion that every minute must justify itself through visible progress. The illusion that calm is laziness, the illusion that attention can always be deferred until after the work is done, as though life waits neatly on the far side of efficiency. Those illusions thinned. In their place came quieter understandings. A bowl can lean slightly and still be true. A meal can begin before the first bite. An evening can be complete without being filled. A day can contain fewer events and more life. Perhaps that is why the slower life so often felt, in these later years, less like surrender than restoration. The world had not become softer or simpler in every way. Bodies still tired, weather still turned, tasks remained. Yet the hours themselves became more breathable. A person could stand at a sink and feel water on the wrist, could sit by a window and let coffee cool enough to deserve a slower sip, could hear the low companionship in another person's presence without rushing to improve the silence between them. And so the episode comes to rest where many of its hours began, in rooms with light entering gradually, in hands doing one thing at a time, in the quiet realization that much of what looked like delay was actually arrival. The slower life did not take the world away. It let the world come near enough to be seen. Then, once seen, it asked for very little beyond continued company. A chair by the window, a table left partly set, the last of the daylight withdrawing from the wall, night gathering without hurry, the mind settling into that older and calmer rhythm in which nothing more needs to be forced and almost nothing real is missing.